Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Health and Sport Committee of 2020. May I take this occasion to wish everyone a Happy New Year. Can I ask all those in the room please to ensure that phones are switched off or to silent, and while it's acceptable to use mobile devices for social media purposes, please do not take photographs or record proceedings. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of the committee's inquiry on supply and demand for medicines, and we are taking evidence from three panels this morning, our first morning of formal evidence taking. And so can I welcome to the committee our first panel, Rosemary Parr, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer with the Scottish Government, Elizabeth Woodison, the Director of Medicines and Pharmacy in the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK Government, and Jonathan Mogford, Director of Policy with Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. So really our first panel therefore allowing us to consider governmental perspectives on these matters, and our focus on this stage is on questions of supply and procurement, purchasing, procurement and access to drugs. So can I perhaps kick off with a general question to all our witnesses. In view of the rate of growth in medicines expenditure, do witnesses believe that the price regulation schemes in place are serving the NHS well? Who would like to start? Elizabeth Woodison.
I'm very happy to start off with that one. You talk about the rate of growth. Interestingly, the latest figures that we're seeing are showing a flatlining, even a slight reduction in medicines spend. But you're right that historically medicine spend has grown and grown faster sometimes than the rate of growth of the NHS budget. So as a result, we have the voluntary scheme that we've negotiated with industry since 1957, I think, the very first PPRS, as it was known, until the latest version of the scheme, which came into effect a year ago, and that is now known as VPAS, the Voluntary Pricing and Access Scheme. The way that scheme works is that it does cap the rate of spend on branded medicines, so that cannot grow more than 2%. And the way it works is that spend above that is reimbursed, or payments are made by industry back to the NHS in England and also Scotland through the arrangements that we have to repay the devolved administrations. So we do believe, coming back to your question, that that is an effective mechanism for capping the rate of growth in branded medicine spend, which is, of course, by far the bulk of the expenditure on medicines. We are grateful to industry for the way that they work with us on the operation of that scheme, and certainly ministers in England feel that the scheme is a success.
Thank you very much. Rosemary Parr.
Thank you for that. And can I say I welcome the Health and Sports Committee inquiry into medicines. And I think it's good to have that conversation around the supply and demand. And I suppose for me, following on our Department of Health colleague statement around how we source medicines, I think there's something there about also setting it in context. So we know that medicines are the most commonly used healthcare interventions, and we know that medicines have been scrutinised and subject to a level of scrutiny for a number of years, particularly since the thalidomide disaster in the 1960s. And we'll hear about legislation and regulation, but if you think about the course of a medicine, from the R&D, from innovation, from the active ingredient to regulation to licensing, and we have our healthcare assessment, SMC and NICE across the UK, and then we look at medicines governance across the health boards with formularies and again into individual prescribing guidance. And again, I think leading us then to the patient and how they actually use and utilise those medicines for health gain. So I suppose for me it's to just start off by saying they have been well scrutinised medicines, and I think we have systems that serve us well about cost and clinical effectiveness. But I think medicines can't be seen in isolation against that pathway of care. And I think also maybe to expand on later is also not just to look at medicines as they are used, but also the health gain used from them. And some of the conversations is not just about access to medicines, but about outcome of medicines as well. So happy to expand on that later too.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan Murphy.
Thank you. Hello. Might be helpful to explain that the MHRA, which is the regulator for the whole of the United Kingdom, our key responsibilities relate to the safety, the quality and the efficacy of pharmaceuticals and devices that are used throughout the European, the United Kingdom. We work in a close partnership, but if you like, it's a triangular partnership with particular relevance to the pricing discussions. So we do not have a direct locus in any of the pricing discussions. Clearly, there are close links in our responsibilities, both with the department and particularly with Liz Widdowson and her team, but also with NICE, which is the English body that is particularly set up to look at the cost effectiveness of products. And whilst there are close links between all three of us, we have distinct and separate responsibilities.
Thank you very much. Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. We've heard that the new price regulation scheme for branded drugs contained a commitment that pharmaceutical companies should offer the same price paid for a drug in one UK country to all other UK countries. Yet, Cancer Research UK suggests that they've heard anecdotally that there are discrepancies in the price for new medicines between the UK countries. Can the witnesses comment on that?
I can say that that certainly is the intention of the scheme, and it is clearly laid out in the scheme, that transparency of pricing between the different countries in the UK. That, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that each country is required to agree the same price. Pricing deals can cover not just the price, but other aspects as well. For example, it might be a different approach. It might be an outcome-based payment scheme. There are all sorts of different types of deals available, as it were. So it could be that Scotland and the other countries choose to do a different pricing deal on an individual product, and that is allowed within the scheme.
And has the new agreement had an impact, demonstrable impact on reducing the discrepancies between UK nations, notwithstanding the point I totally accept that countries may choose to do things differently?
I really don't know the answer to that, because we don't track what deals are being done in the other countries. So I honestly couldn't tell you the answer to that.
I mean, thank you. And again, I think it's quite early days for the scheme, so I think what we are doing is working with our partners and the industry to get that transparency. And we certainly have had those conversations across both our Department of Health colleagues and our other devolved administration colleagues about that transparency in individuals. So yeah, I think we are on that road to having a similar framework within a similar pricing outcome. So I think we are absolutely, I think, having those positive conversations.
Thank you very much. And perhaps, Rosemary Parr, you could add a little more about how the pricing mechanisms are negotiated. For instance, we heard that some of the money comes back ultimately to the devolved administrations. How has that worked? How is that negotiated, and how does that operate?
Yeah, thank you. And that is a really important question, I think, for Scotland as well. And you do know that, obviously, that the licensing and pricing of medicines are reserved matters for the UK. And MHRA obviously do look at the primary regulation for safe products as they come onto the market, and also pharmacovigilance afterwards. So for me, there is something there about how we also then utilise our levers within Scotland. And I think what we have done, and we continue to have the policy around using the money that's given back from the industry, PPRS scheme as it was, and now VPAS, going directly into the New Medicines Fund. And that has been, I think, a really positive policy for Scotland, where people will see the increase in medicines and the increase in medicines use, but they absolutely also see that rebate being used very transparently around a New Medicines Fund. And boards have gained over the course of the last 5 years, and are due to gain up to 90 million or so in this current year as well. So it's a very important aspect of that rebate and how we use it.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. In our written submissions, there was quite a call for a sort of different approach to the pricing, which would reward the most effective medicines, incentivise sort of the pharmaceutical industry to develop better medicines. So I wonder if the panel would agree that we should be moving towards that sort of value-based pricing.
Maybe by just having, I think, an overview look at that, and I think it's a really important question. So for me, we have a lot of scrutiny, again, I think, over access to new medicines and access to medicines, whether that's from people purchasing their own medicines through a community pharmacy, or people going to have a prescription from their healthcare professional. And access is very important, and people obviously are living longer, and that's a good thing. But I think we also need to turn the narrative onto outcomes, and that health gain that we gain from medicines, and how we actually then utilise that going forward. I think in primary care, you will know that we have quite a lot of good data in prescribing, and we can track quite easily in many ways the amount of drugs that are prescribed and who they're prescribed to on an individual patient basis. But in hospital and secondary care, we don't have as good ways to track data. So there's something there for me about trying to get prescribing decisions that are based on good data, good evidence, and then in the longer term also how we look at outcomes or health gain for those medicines. And I think there are steps towards that, but I do think your question is really important, that in essence we actually turn that narrative to looking at health gain. And I think that's important for prescribers to be able to prescribe in an evidence-based way, but also I think for the industry to avoid waste, to avoid prescribing unnecessarily, and to, I think, most importantly, for patients to get the best gain from their medicines and the reduced harm.
Other witnesses want to add anything on that point? Elizabeth Woodson.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to remember the role of NICE in England and the SMC in Scotland, because of course they do look at the value of the medicine in the sense that when they're making their assessments, they're not just looking at the price, they're also looking at the evidence about the benefit that is delivered. So when they approve a medicine, they're looking at cost effectiveness, which, as I say, is not just the price, but also the effectiveness of the medicine. So the value is taken into account in that sense, because, of course, the NICE assessment is a key factor in whether medicines are available, and the pricing deals that are done are obviously taking into account the NICE assessment of cost effectiveness.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Just if I could just pick up a small point you made there around the collection of data within secondary care. So we've got good data through primary care. It would require then a mechanism or a platform for that to be recorded within secondary care. Is that available, or does that need to be developed to enable that to happen?
We're at the start of that journey, I think. HEPMA, as it's known, is a hospital electronic prescribing and management system for medicines. And it's a number of boards across Scotland do have a HEPMA system. So electronically you can then collect what is prescribed, and also some aspects of where that's used, and also obviously you've got the patient in front of you to see how that works or doesn't work. So what we have as a policy as part of our strategy in achieving excellence is to move that HEPMA forward across the whole of Scotland. And a number of boards, including Lothian and Glasgow, the kind of larger boards, are also looking at that implementation. So I think we are getting to a better stage about trying to collect data in secondary care, and I think that's really important because we have information, I suppose, for me around aspects of how we dispense, we purchase, but we definitely need some data, I think, around how we prescribe better, particularly for some of the new medicines that will be coming along that may be personalised, it may be more about people's gene therapy and how people are treated individually. I think that's going to be even more important. So for me, you'll hear people talking about real-world data as well. And I think that's also important. We'll see that some of our clinical trials that are used around our healthcare technology assessment, so SMC and NICE will look at early evidence on a population level to look at clinical and cost effectiveness. But when you actually go to take a medicine in Greater Glasgow Health Board, where some of our patients have comorbidities and may also be very different from the clinical trial population, the real world data or the efficacy can be very different. So I think there is now hopefully a trajectory to try and get more of that real world data. HEPMA will help in secondary care, but we also need to look at outcomes, I think, for medicines across the piece. We have a glimmer of hope, I think, and government have sponsored over the last number of years a programme looking at that, how drugs are used and utilised and what the outcomes are after they've been given in the real world population. And the Cancer Medicines Outcome Programme, which has been going for a number of years, has actually shown that the effectiveness would be very different for people potentially with multimorbidity. So we need to, I think, capture some of that and make that available across Scotland so that we can actually not just look at access, but look at how medicines are work and how they work for different population levels.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I would just like to ask a question on value and outcome-based pricing. Is if we go down this route, how do we get to a situation where we manage the expectation of the individuals living with the long-term condition, or because they'll just see a drug company. I'll give an example. My wife's got multiple sclerosis. Every time there's a newspaper story about a new wonder drug for MS, my mother-in-law ends up giving us a bit of newspaper that goes on the fridge, you know, cut out of it. Now, that happens in real life, and they think, oh, here's this new drug, this company says it does X, Y, and Z. How do we manage that expectation to make sure that we're getting to that stage where it's out-based pricing, and at the same time the public appreciate that? Because a lot of the time some of these drugs won't actually make the big differences that some of the individuals think it will.
I do agree with that. I think there are, I suppose, issues there about how people look at medicines across society. And our CMO in Scotland has had, for a number of years, realistic medicine as a strategy, which includes lots of areas around how we, I suppose, medicalise many things across society. And medicines obviously are part of that, but it's how people perhaps value medicines that's important. There is that old saying about a pill for every ill that we know is not correct. But we absolutely want to encourage innovation across lots of areas of long-term conditions or places where there really is a direct need for medicines in conditions, and MS is obviously one of them. So for me, it's about trying to educate and inform patients around the value of medicines, where they can work and sometimes where they perhaps don't work. And I think that starts on the whole journey for me. It's about where we look at how patients can look at self-care. And self-care is a really important part of healthcare and health gain. And we see our 1,257 community pharmacists across Scotland able to give that advice and self-care, perhaps around over-the-counter medicines or in fact just around advice or referral. So self-care, I think, is important. And I think for me also then, if we are looking at prescribing, it has to be effective and efficient. So it brings in, I think, what that efficacy is. SMC will do that for us on a population level, and on an individual level, prescribers and prescriber guidance will be guided for that. I think for me, there's also bits of the jigsaw missing. I think because we see patients, I think, actively looking for new medicines, I think we also have to have greater systems for medication review. And medication review is really important so that people aren't just started on their medicine and then not looked at again. They may have harm from their medicine and they may have no benefit. So I think we have to have better systems of medication review and that capacity to do that. Again, in Achieving Excellence, the strategy for pharmaceutical care, we are saying that community pharmacists potentially could look at long-term conditions and medication review for those people in society who are worried or perhaps need some review around their medicines. We see the growth of pharmacists and technicians in GP practice, again looking at systems of prescribing and also, I think, looking at systems of de-prescribing, which is equally important. So again, that review is important as well. And lastly, I think for me, there is something about how we can educate people to not think that a prescription is the first thing. We have to look, I think, not just at self-care, but also I think we need to look at aspects of talking therapies. We need to look at other aspects of social prescribing. And that's a mindset change, I think, for patients and the public. And some of that discussion, I think, needs to happen. For me, a glimmer of hope is we can do this. We've seen with antibiotic prescribing, and we know the difficulty with resistance around antibiotics, that patient's expectation can be changed. And we know since 2013 to in the next 5 years, 8% of antibiotic prescribing has been reduced. So patients aren't going to a GP to expect a prescription. They are absolutely not expecting a prescription for perhaps a viral illness. So how do we utilise some of those tactics to reduce the expectations for prescriptions and in some ways, I think, reduce some of that perhaps hope and outcome?
Jonathan Mumford.
I think we'd very much endorse the points that other members of the panel have been making, particularly about how the licensing process is part of the important interaction with companies that ensures that the claims made for products are claims that are backed with clear scientific evidence. But then one of the things we are very conscious of as, if you like, the safety, quality and efficacy regulator is the importance of the links and the joined up systems with the healthcare systems and with the organisations responsible for cost effectiveness of products and ensuring that patients and clinicians fully understand the nature of the products that are being used. Because ultimately that is one of the key points of interaction is between the individual patient and the clinician.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thanks. It's just to pick up what you said, Rosemary, about HEPMA. And I've experienced a HEPMA when I worked in recovery room. It was starting to be rolled out in NHS Dumfries and Galloway. Where are we with HEPMA and the rollout across Scotland, and how are we able to better use data, especially when we're looking at prescribing in secondary care?
It is a good question. In Dumfries and Galloway and some of the smaller boards have absolutely fully implemented HEPMA. And Ayrshire and Arran as an NHS board has had HEPMA in some of its hospitals for a long time. So we have that experience, I think, on how to roll out a bit quicker. So I think if I was being critical of HEPMA, it's just not happened fast enough. But I think in the last few months and certainly the last year or so, we have had much more pace and traction. We know that Lothian have gone to their, NHS Lothian have gone to their final business case, and we know that Glasgow are quite close to that as well. So for us, I think once we get that aspect of the big health boards, I think utilising HEPMA, I think that will be really important. Then the north of Scotland have a regional approach to HEPMA, and they will be doing that in a quite a mannered way. And again, I think the funding that's been given hopefully will be able to bring that forward in a bit quicker way than it has been in the past few years. I think thereafter, once we have electronic prescribing, we're in a much better position to get better data and outcomes. It won't be the complete answer when we get to HEPMA stage 1, but we then need to look at a platform around how we actually utilise that data on a once for Scotland basis. Scotland's not that big a country, and we can imagine looking at outcomes and data. 5 million or so of a population is actually a really good size to look at what might happen with some of our drugs in action. So I think the next stage to that will also be our national digital platform, which there are plans there for that too around our digital strategy to try and look at then what happens, not just about prescribing, but again going to outcomes and data. And we see other countries across the world, I think, being able to do some of that, being able to look at their population and see what gain they get or health gain they get from medicines and other healthcare interventions. So I think quite a positive story in the next few years around HEPMA.
Okay.
Briefly, Brian Biddle.
Just on that point there about obviously being able to register or data around drug prescription within secondary care. To go to that sort of outcomes focus, a lot of the prescription within a secondary care environment are then taken outside of a secondary care into primary care. So the link then must be, if you're going to measure those outcomes between secondary and primary care, which I don't think really exists at the moment. Again, is that the direction of travel we think we're going in?
Yeah, it is the direction of travel we're going in, and I think it's absolutely required. So your point is a good one about how do we link up primary, secondary care and social care, and that's not there. Presently, how do we get that electronic single patient record that will be data driven? And I think that is absolutely ambition to do that. And we have really good connections around that in community pharmacy and GP practice. We've had electronic transfer of prescribing data for some while, but how do we make that seamless? And for me, it would be bring an end to some of the issues about where we have some, I suppose, fall down in care between different areas of care. And we know that when people are discharged from hospital and go back into community, some of the boundaries are not quite as seamless as they should be. Medicines reconciliation is quite difficult to do when you're working on a paper system. How would we be able to do and reconcile that medicines between primary and secondary care if we had electronic data transfer? It would be much easier to do that. We look towards new technologies to be able to allow us to do that. And I think that would be where we would want to be. We also, as you know, I think have to put some energies behind this because the amount of people we treat, I think, in secondary care is increasing. But what we absolutely want to do is to allow those people in secondary care who are able to be stabilised on their medicines to come into primary care and to live more at home or in a homely setting. But we need the systems to do that. I think we need that transfer of prescriptions that's safe and effective, and we need community pharmacy, I think, also to allow us to get not just those prescriptions that are perhaps more complex than perhaps they've been used to around secondary care prescribing, but also then to utilise some, for me, the long-term conditions and adverse effects around those medicines. So for me, the answer is transfer of data that we understand and we think have confidence in, medication review and medication, I think also reconciliation across the piece.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David Turns.
Convener, good morning panel. Some of the biggest increases in prices in recent years have reportedly been seen in generic medicines. The Health Service Costs Act 2017 gave ministers a power to intervene to control the price of generics where there is insufficient competition. Can you confirm whether or not these powers have been used yet? And if not, why not?
Yes, you are right that we have seen increases in the price of some generic medicines, but it really is a relatively small number where we've seen what look like extremely steep and potentially unjustifiable increases. But I think it is important to put that in the context that overall the price of generics in the UK does actually compare very favourably with other countries, and we do have, and we know this from research and reports, we do have pretty much the lowest prices amongst comparable OECD countries. And as I say, that has been confirmed by independent reports. So I think broadly, the system we have of competition in the generics market is effective, and we do get a good deal. As I say, I wanted to set that general context. But you are right that we have been concerned by a handful of products which seem to fall outside that pattern, and that's where usually there isn't effective competition. They're from a single supplier, and there aren't any other suppliers in the market. So we did look at what we could do about that, and we did take those price-setting powers. Alongside those, we took the power to get information from the companies to explain the reason, the rationale behind these price increases. And of course, we would hope that through starting by requiring the information and having the dialogue with the company, that it wouldn't ultimately be necessary to use the price setting power, because we'd be able to come to an agreement with the company before reaching that point. Price setting, dictating the selling price of a product, would obviously be a very significant intervention in a marketplace. So it is very, very important that we consider very carefully how to do that, to ensure that we get it right and that we can win any challenge that the company might bring. So we have been putting a lot of work into this, working with our commercial directorate as well, just checking out whether there are other approaches that we could use that would be equally effective and perhaps less interventionist and draconian, if you like. So I can assure you that there is a lot of active consideration going on this, and we would expect to be consulting on these processes during the course of this year, in fact.
I think the answer just go answer a
I'll
second part.
answer the question. Can I confirm these powers are UK government powers? There is no Scottish counterpart, so it would be for Department of Health ministers to make such orders, and they would have application across the UK. Is that correct?
To be honest, I'm not 100% sure, and I'd rather not mislead the committee.
Sure.
Would you mind if I let you know afterwards?
Not at all.
Either of my colleagues can actually remember on that point.
It certainly is UK legislation, and I think we've been part of that, absolutely part of those discussions over the course since the Act came in 2017. So yeah, I think that is important that we are, I suppose, joined up in that way. I suppose the other issue to think about that question from a Scottish perspective is, I suppose, for me, around the Scottish drug tariff and how we determine as government and ministers the reimbursement price paid back to NHS contractors, and those Scottish drug tariff arrangements, which include generic and branded drugs, which are generally competitive, I think I would agree, across the UK generally. I think we also have one of the 84% of our prescribing is on generic prescribing just now, and I think that's been very cost effective for the NHS across the piece. I think the other way around cost effectiveness is also, I think, looking at aspects of prescribing guidance, and we will see across Scotland there's been millions of pounds saved around changing people not just to generics but also to biosimilars, which are not quite generics but similar in a way to the active ingredient that they were using previously. So there are some areas where within Scotland we can be quite nimble, I think, about trying to get the best price available for the NHS.
Okay, thank you very much. Alice Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I just wanted to have a follow-up question around generic competition, and specifically, does the Mhra have any opportunity to encourage manufacturers to submit an application as such?
We don't. We operate essentially on response to applications from companies for licenses, both for generics and all pharmaceuticals. What we do look to do is to ensure that the processes that we run, the openness of the way in which the organisation operates, is as appropriately supportive as it can be for companies who want to bring generic pharmaceuticals, and indeed all pharmaceuticals, to the UK market.
And thinking about that market specifically, is there anything you believe Mhra could do to encourage greater competition and people and companies actually accessing the UK market?
I think the fundamental point about the licensing is that it has to be on response from an application from a company or an organisation or a body to put a product on the market. Of course, in the generic sector, that doesn't necessarily have to be a company in the traditional sense. The licensing process is essentially a process where you agree with the person, the entity, who is taking responsibility for a product and the use of that product on the market. But the nature of the interaction has to be that we respond to companies, organisations that wish to bring those products to the market and take the responsibility for those products on the UK market.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. In that case, if MHRA does not essentially have the capacity or the remit to encourage competition, is such an approach taken elsewhere in government, or in the absence of, if MHRA, if I understand you rightly, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying your role is to respond to an application rather than to encourage applications?
Well, and to ensure that application process and the process of issuing the licences for the UK runs as smoothly and as quickly as it can, yes.
So, coming back to Elizabeth Woodison's points about considering other options apart from a price intervention, are there other levers at hand that can enable competition to be stimulated, other than, or if you're seeking not to intervene as a primary choice in dealing with excessive price?
That is absolutely the question that we are considering, and why we haven't rushed to use the price setting powers, because we do need to think about whether there are other ways of generating competition and encouraging new entrants to come to the market. Well, I think, you know, we can all imagine what those might be. One might offer a higher price for new entrants to come in, you know, fixed contracts, direct procurement, purchasing, all of these options are obviously sort of different ways to doing it. So we are looking at that to sort of inform our consultation, which should be more in the round and not looking purely at shall we impose a price, because of course the risk of just imposing a price is that if you get it wrong, there's a possibility that the company could just choose to withdraw from the market altogether. And that, of course, could be a disaster for patients dependent on that medicine. So we do feel we need to sort of tread very carefully here. It's a balance, and that's why that sort of consultation is taking a little while to develop. But as I say, we've got plans this year to get that out.
Thank you very much. You offered to come back to us on the working of the Act in relation to the devolved administrations. Look forward to that. It might be helpful as well if you were at that point able to give us any kind of update on the considerations in that consultation.
Of course.
At the same time. Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Just to pick up on issues around the Scottish drugs tariff, the NHS pays community pharmacists as subcontractors for the cost of medicines set out in the Scottish drugs tariffs, and that's negotiated between the government and community pharmacists. So, and there's been some issues raised around the commonly used drugs like paracetamol, and that's hit the media about the prescribing of paracetamol. And I know that high street shops and supermarkets can you can buy paracetamol for 20 pence, but the NHS will pay community pharmacists substantially more for that. We looked at £4 and 5 pence for 100 paracetamol, although or £1.81 depending on whether you're buying caps or tabs. So why is there such a difference between the pricing for that the NHS pays for drugs like paracetamol?
I mean, it is a good point, isn't it? And I suppose for me it's about how we utilise, how we reimburse community pharmacists across the piece, and the Scottish drug tariff is part and parcel of that. Obviously, it's down to Part 7, which is a generic aspect of that. Excuse me. So you raised some points there about generic medicines that also can be contained, bought over the counter, for want of a better word. And I suppose, go back to the issue about self-care, I think pharmacists would always want to say self-care in the first instance, whether that's about areas of analgesics or other places. And I think we would also be mindful of the fact that a prescriber will issue a prescription for a long-term condition as it's needed. And there may be lots of people out there on drugs like paracetamol or ibuprofen who actually do need that for long-term pain control. And going to a community pharmacist or another outlet to buy a small amount of paracetamol would probably not be cost effective for them. So generally it's long-term conditions that these analgesics are used for, and generally I think in many ways that is relatively cost effective across the piece. So we have to actually think again what I suppose our Scottish drug tariff is there for. It reimburses community pharmacists absolutely for the price of the drugs that they've already bought, that they've taken that risk in buying into the community pharmacy. But it also, for me, pays for aspects of the service around community pharmacy too. So we have now a contract agreement with our Scottish pharmacy contractors around acute prescribing, which everyone will see when they take a prescription to the pharmacist, but also then around a pharmacy first service that will be rolled out from April this year to look at aspects of how pharmacists can not just look at being able to self-care, but also to look at aspects of pharmacy first treatment. That will be including antibiotics for a urinary tract infection and also for some skin problems as well. And this is to avoid going to a prescriber, going to the GP, going to A&E, and being able to actually take some of that burden into community pharmacy. So for me, it's less about what the drugs might be within that tariff, but it's how they're utilised and how they're used and how they're reviewed. And in the longer term, I think we absolutely want long-term conditions to look at that aspect of how pharmacists can, either in primary care or in community pharmacy, look at trying to reduce polypharmacy and look at that aspects of, I suppose, some patients taking way too many medicines, perhaps not being reviewed in long enough time scale. So I think there is something about, if people are prescribing a medicines, it generally is for a long-term condition, it's generally required, they should be reviewed, and generally buying over the counter would be for small amounts of drugs or medicines that potentially would be quite difficult for the patient in the long term.
And it is important to highlight that people that are on paracetamol as a long-term condition are often on paracetamol to reduce the amount of morphine-based, opiate-based meds, which even them in itself are more expensive than the paracetamol. So there is a difference between the short-term paracetamol for a cold or a flu versus long-term pain management.
A good point, and in essence we've tested some of those arguments around if paracetamol was just available elsewhere, what would happen, and we think in prescribing terms it would go much more towards an opiate based analgesic, and again the harm around that might be much worse. So you raise a good point.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Brief supplementary, Miles, please.
I wanted to go to one of the solutions around some of this, and it's specifically around access to patient data and IT systems. And I co-chair the cross-party group on cancer, and a lot of our discussions hark back 15 years ago to what was being suggested. So I wanted to ask, why is it that our current IT systems are so behind other European countries?
In essence, I think HEPMA's really difficult to, it seems easy to do, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to roll out. Electronic prescribing is very different. We have had in secondary care a cardiac system for over 50 years, a paper-driven system that I suppose our healthcare practitioners are very used to, but it definitely, I think, isn't fit for purpose for the future. So you are right, I think there's a bit of impatience about why we're not there yet. Particularly in cancer, we can point to, I think, some good examples around chemo care where they do have good data around prescribing and patients. And that's where we decided to try and use, I suppose, that intelligence around our Cancer Medicines Outcome Programme, or CMOP, because we have that data. But if you think about having that for all of our medicines, that would give us some huge, I suppose, evidence to utilise how we prescribe in the future. And so I think there is frustration, but absolutely we know we can do that through chemo care, as using an example. I think HEPMA and the systems that come through our digital national platform will absolutely, I think, revolutionise what we do. And I say that because although we're really, I think, focused on our medicines and our tariff and what we have just now, I think that's really important. And we've got SMC, who are world beating, I think, on looking at health population and cost and clinical effectiveness. Times of medicines are changing. We'll see some of our cancer therapies not looking to some of the cytotoxics and quite toxic drugs we had previously, but looking at some immune therapy. We look forward to some advanced therapeutic medicinal therapies that sometimes don't look like medicines at all, but look very much different. And how will our health service and our systems and our data cope with that as well? I think for a small number of patients it might be easy, but looking at that on a population basis, I think, is something that will be a challenge for the future. How do we deal as a system with a stratified medicine, personalised medicine, where in actual fact we'll not be looking at waste, but we'll be looking at very individual prescriptions for individual people? And I think we absolutely need the IT and the data to be able to cope with that.
Sandra White.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your evidence so far. It's been very, very interesting. I wanted to go back to the Home Office and the licensing for controlled drugs. We received submissions from various, groups, etc. And one of the submissions came from the University of Edinburgh, and they actually highlighted that care homes are not permitted to hold a licence to keep controlled drugs in stock, where hospices, which are even out with the NHS, are given the licences. And the submission that we received, it basically claimed that care homes were increasingly using just-in-time boxes to sort of manage and get around the need for a licence. But obviously lots of medicines are now then returned to the pharmacy because they don't have this licence. So I wanted to ask, I think it's Elizabeth, or the UK representative perhaps, or anyone who wants to answer the question, to explain why the law does not require basically a hospice to have a Home Office licence, basically in order to stock the drugs, but a care home does. And is there any movement to change that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do highlight a good issue there. We see that our citizens who go into care homes potentially might be there for 15 or 18 months. So in many cases, we are talking about palliative care, I think, for some of our care home residents. So there is an issue, I think, there that we do get round just now. And I think we've got a piece of work looking at how medication is used within care homes. And part of our strategy in achieving excellence is looking at that. And we have a clinical fellow who's just now looking at aspects of how we can improve medication in care homes, not just about access, but also about usage. And she's an expert in palliative care. So we're looking at how we can help, not particularly around legislation there, but how we can help bring that forward. And we do have a network of community pharmacists who are experts in palliative care and who will hold some of that medication for palliative care as well. And that's for adult palliative care. What we need to do, I think, is make more inroads into paediatric palliative care. And CHAS, who is you'll know, is the Association of Hospices for Children, is also looking at a pilot programme in Forth Valley to look at pharmacists looking at palliative care needs, very special and complex needs for children in palliative care. So there are workarounds, I think, just now to help. But I think in the longer term, changes to how we look at, I think, care homes, I think is really important.
Okay. I mean, the point I was trying to get across anyway is the fact that the Home Office licenses controlled drugs. As you mentioned yourself, Rosemary, there's people in the care homes who are there, could be there longer than 18 months even, and yet they're not licensed the same as hospices are. So, and you mentioned about the trial period and what's happening just now. Is there a reason why they're not licensed? The people who are running the care homes, are they not professional enough to administer these drugs? And is there a movement on to, as you say, community pharmacies worked along with them? Yes, they can go in certain aspects. But why don't care homes have the licence?
I think that is a legal issue. So I think the legislation would have to be changed to allow care homes, I think, to prescribe in controlled drug level. But I think there is enough expertise out there to allow, I suppose, healthcare professionals and care homes to be able to do that. I think it's potentially around capacity, but potentially not around competence. So there's something there for me. How do we do that in a safe, guideline, evidence-based manner? So I think some of the work we're looking at in care homes will be quite helpful in that. And we look forward to receiving some of that and happy to give any more information you would need around that as well.
Can I, just a small, thank you for that clarification. So if we were wishing care homes to be able to be licensed, we would need to approach the UK government because they license it, not through the Scottish government. So
clarification. I think Sandra's asking that precise point. If there was a change, the legislation which governs this point is UK legislation, and therefore it would be the UK Parliament rather than the Scottish Parliament that would address that.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
The controlled drugs are UK legislation.
That's the point I was making. That no, I thought maybe I just didn't explain it right. But obviously, when I mentioned Home Office licences, I thought. But I don't know if Elizabeth wants to come in on that, or just the clarification is the same as it is.
Well, it is indeed a matter for the Home Office. The Home Office to lawfully possess or supply, produce, manufacture, cultivate controlled drugs. Any of these activities require a licence from the Home Office. I'm not aware that there's a sort of blanket restriction on care homes being able to have a licence. It would be interesting to explore that further. Clearly, I think it would depend on the staff. If they actually had a registered professional doctor on site, then I would have thought that person could have a licence. So I somehow doubt that there's a sort of blanket prescription that says no care home can ever have a licence for holding controlled drugs, but that's something that one would need to explore with the Home Office.
Pick that up.
It would certainly be helpful to have greater clarity on that going forward. David Stewart.
Good morning to the panel. I'm interested in looking at your post-Brexit strategy, and if I could start with Jonathan. My particular interest is the approval of new drugs. And in very simplistic terms, as I understand it, there's two main routes. One is through the European Medicines Agency, and one is through your own organisation, Jonathan. Obviously, we're reaching a Brexit point. I think you've just evicted the EMA, or who are going to Amsterdam. What will the relationship you will have with them in the future? Again, at very simplistic terms, if two agencies were approving new drugs and we're effectively down to one, I would have thought, from an outside perspective, that puts a lot of strain on your organisation for approval. Clearly, there'll still be a relationship with the EMA, but could you describe to the committee what will be happening? Is there prospects of delay? And frankly, are you looking for new funds to expand your organisation? Because you'll need it from the start of next month.
Right, okay. Right, thank you very much. I mean, you're right. This is it's a big and a complex area, and still evolving as the positions for the next round of the European negotiations are all clarified. But broadly, yes, what you outlined is broadly the situation, that actually pretty much all of medicines regulation and indeed devices regulation is done in European-based networks at the moment. For pharmaceuticals, there are two broad types of market entry regulation. The European Medicines Evaluation Agency coordinates the process for a relatively small number of the most innovative products. And then the main route for most of the rest of the products is, if you like, a bundled set of national licenses that operate under what's called a decentralised process. But that too is one where the member states essentially work together to arrive at a common type of licence for the whole of the European Union, including the UK. There are also significant links where we all have worked together on pharmacovigilance and inspection and the like. The European Medicines Agency has moved to Amsterdam already. We didn't evict them; they moved, and that's been part of a bigger process that has been going on over the last couple of 2.5 years since the referendum, where, particularly on the pharmaceutical side, EU27 have been preparing and increasingly preparing themselves to operate as a group of EU27. And clearly that brings to the whole question of what the UK's relationship with Europe, and indeed actually the rest of the world, will be in a post-Brexit situation. Because I think it is also important just to bear in mind that although we've spent a lot of time in the last few years focusing on a really important aspect, which is the linkages across Europe, essentially product development, particularly in pharmaceuticals, but also medical devices, is actually global. A lot of the standards are global, and there's very close working across all of the different, across the across the regulators globally.
I'm sorry, rushing.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious a
Yeah.
bit of time, and I'm asking some complicated questions. A few minutes to go. Could you just clarify then, for my own understanding and for the committees? Obviously, there's still a lot of discussion to be had between the UK government and Europe over the details of the transition period. What is your understanding about the role of EMA from the 1st of February? Has that been clarified by the discussions between the UK government and the 27? Will they have their current role will continue, or is it completely stopped from 1st of February,
No.
or is it halfway house,
No.
as most things are?
From the 1st of February, essentially the systems remain operating at a EU27 plus the UK. The big difference is that the UK, for the period of the implementation period, will not be leading scientific assessment and scientific work within the system. However, the centrally authorised products will continue to be licensed for EU27 plus the UK, and these decentralised products, the generic products, will similarly be licensed and will be valid for the UK. So in practical terms, there's absolutely no regulatory cliff edge at the end of January, and the systems continue on. There's still work that is going on on the negotiation for the longer term and what will happen there. Within the political declaration, both sides undertook to explore possibilities of cooperation, and that could take a whole range of different meanings, including mutual recognition agreements or exchanges of information and the like. But there's still work on
So
that.
again, in a nutshell, I'm sorry, pressurize you on time.
I know.
Is there any prospects of delay for approval of new drugs? And is there going to be greater strain placed on your own organisation because of the changes?
There's no the systems will continue as they continue from the end of this month. So there is no reason at all for there to be delay in the regulation of new products. We will clearly be we're clearly considering and will need to further consider in the light of what is decided for the longer term, what that will mean for the agency in terms of the agency's work.
And I'll bring in the other panellists if they wish to contribute. Final question on time, and again, I apologise, it's quite a complex area, is US-UK trade negotiations. More a statement rather than a question is you will know from general commentaries that the US sees itself as subsidising the cost of medicines across the world. I don't know if you've got a particular answer to that, but we did have a quick look at the price of the top 20 drugs in the US and the same drugs in the UK, and you will know this, but it's roughly 5 times more in the US than it is here. So my argument, if it waddles and it quacks, it's a duck, is probably a relevant point there. Is there prospects, when we have trade negotiations with the US, this will hit drug prices in the UK?
Well, we are well aware that prices are typically higher in the States. So there is clearly a risk there, and it's one that we've been aware of for a long time. So we were very pleased to see very strong statements from our government around this. And the manifesto itself state, it's very clear on this point, and I'll quote, it says, when we are negotiating trade deals, the NHS will not be on the table. The price the NHS pays for drugs will not be on the table. The services the NHS provides will not be on the table. So our ministers are well aware of this risk, and both our Health Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, but also the Prime Minister have made very strong statements around the pricing of medicines not being any part of these trade negotiations with the states.
Sure, and the convener will not allow me to make any political points. I merely make the point that trade with the US is obviously vitally important, particularly now we're leaving the EU. But if I can raise a Scottish whisky issue, you'll know that Scottish whisky's now just had a tariff of 25%, which it didn't have just a few weeks ago. So, there's obviously concerns about what's said at the macro level. What happens in reality, any trade deal involves negotiation on both sides, and something has to give. But I hope that reassurance happens, and perhaps if it doesn't, we can have UK ministers back here in a year or two. But perhaps I should leave it at that before I get into trouble.
Thank you very much. Raising political issues is one thing. Raising Scotch whisky in a discussion on medicines is another altogether. Can I come back to some of the issues around the MHRA and certainly the Royal College of General Practitioners was quite critical of licence approvals from the EMA in relation to cancer drugs, and critical in the sense of saying that some of these approvals are not based on any evidence of benefit, either in survival or quality of life. Now, I understand safety and efficacy is your focus rather than value, but I'd be very interested to know in the licensing process what the standard of evidence is, whether there's a requirement for peer review of claims that are made for particular drugs, and whether you're satisfied with the quality of research that goes behind drug applications that come forward, license applications that come forward.
Right. I mean, the processes are peer reviewed, and certainly most cancer products fall into this category of the centrally authorised products in Europe. So they're overseen by the European Medicines Agency. That brings together regulators from across EU27 in peer-reviewed processes for the assessment, but also peer review of the clinical trial evidence that is generated and forms the fundamental basis of the decisions. Clearly, the regulator, the MHRA, and the safety, quality, efficacy focus of the decision about whether a product is suitable to get onto the market and meets the claims that are made for it are one part of that more complex and bigger set of questions, particularly in terms of work that colleagues in NICE do about the cost effectiveness that should be applied to that product. But we are confident as the MHRA in the rigour of the scientific understanding that sits behind those judgments. But it is the case that different products have different level of benefits that they are bringing.
And would you, as a regulator, welcome real-world data as a means of checking, if you like, of affirming these conclusions?
I mean, that's an increasing and very interesting debate that we are very enthusiastic about. And one of the things that we are highly conscious of is that as pressure, and entirely legitimate and understandable pressure, to agree early use of products increases, clearly that means use at stages where the evidence of the sometimes particularly the effectiveness may be well and usefully supplemented with further evidence, real-world evidence, particularly in early use. And indeed, we're particularly interested in what could be done about greater use of real-world evidence in the market entry decisions as well. Those are very active discussions, and certainly as IT and data systems improve in health systems, we clearly expect that this will be an area of great development over the coming years.
Thank you very much. Rosemary Parr.
I would agree with that. I think there is an issue there about as we give more flexibility to SMC, our health technology assessment for clinical and cost effectiveness, we are seeing medicines, I think, coming with a bit less evidence base, a bit earlier. We're seeing earlier access to some medicines. So I think we have that flexibility to look at what an interim acceptance might be. And I know you're seeing SMC colleagues later as well. So I think there's something there about the evidence and the maturity of that evidence that is changing. We are seeing medicines, I think, at an earlier stage of their development. So it's even more important, I think, we have that check and balance around harm and benefit as we use them.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I thank all of our witnesses on this panel this morning. It's been much appreciated. And I know there are a number of items on which I think you intend to come back to us with.
Leave the strategy. I've spoken about a number of times, achieving excellent strategy. I can give the colleagues some of that as well. I know it's all about medicines and pharmacy.
That'll be very helpful.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll briefly suspend before calling the next session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And can I welcome everyone back to our second panel of evidence on the supply and demand for medicines. Our second panel this morning is comprised of industry representatives, and I'm pleased to welcome to the committee Alison Culpin, Scotland Director of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, Warwick Smith, Director General of the British Generic Manufacturers Association, and Martin Sawyer, Executive Director of the Healthcare Distribution Association. Welcome, and again, as with the previous panel, we'll seek to ask a range of questions over around an hour, and if there are issues that we're unable to address within that time that you think we ought to know about, please feel free to supplement your evidence afterwards. Can I start off by asking yourselves from an industry perspective the same question that I asked to start the first panel, which is how the price regulation schemes in place work from an industry point of view? Alison Culpin.
Sure, I'd be happy to start, and thank you very much for inviting us to give evidence this morning. Within Scotland, we think they work very well. You have the Scottish Medicines Consortium, which will work out the clinical and cost effectiveness of a medicine for the patients in Scotland. You have national procurement to do a very good job in trying to make sure that our members give them the best deal possible. So we actually think you've got a system here that is working well from that perspective. And on top of that, as Elizabeth told you about, we have the arrangement between industry and the UK government, but the Scottish government play a large role in that too, where there's a 2% cap on growth of any branded medicines. So basically anything over and above that for new medicines goes back into the NHS. And we are fortunate in Scotland that that's used for the New Drugs Fund. So that's a very good way we believe in it being utilised. And actually this morning, I think what I'd like to announce is that we know that between 2019 and 20, that Scotland's going to get £70 million back into that fund. So we're very happy with that arrangement. It gives surety to the NHS in Scotland. It's one of the reasons why you've got this basically flat line of spend on medicines. But I think it's also important to remember that the percentage cost in what we spend in medicines now in 2020 is only 1% more than what we spent on medicines in 1948. So as a percentage of the NHS spend, we are actually just spending the same percentages. And yet, when we look at the great advances that we've made through medicines, where in the last 40 years we can look at cancer and we can see that the survival rates have doubled. We've got a very ambitious scheme in Scotland, which is through medicines where we're going to eradicate hepatitis C. And I could go on. There's a plethora of things that basically, since 1948, has made a huge difference to the lives and quality of lives of people, including in Scotland.
You make a very strong point there about the stability of the percentage spent on medicines. Clearly, the volume has increased, of course, because the volume of health spending has increased. That containment of the share of the budget across the piece, is that, do you think, a consequence of a sequence or a series of effective disciplinary mechanisms or control mechanisms within the NHS? And do you think do you feel that is evolving in a way that the industry can live with and support?
So I think it's a combination of good stewardship from the officials working for the Scottish Government and the industry playing its part in trying to make sure that the NHS is sustainable when it comes to using the medicines. Going forward, we expect that these schemes will continue. We've had them in place, as Elizabeth said, since 1957, so over 60 years. So we don't see that stopping. And what tends to happen is the schemes tend to reflect what's going on in the environment at that time. And so we think we can look forward to working in this partnership with the governments of the day to make sure that patients still access our innovative medicines.
Thank you very much. Warwick Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to answer the question both in terms of the price and the attractiveness of the market that is created for companies to launch generics into the UK. And I say the UK, not just Scotland, because for generics, volume is a big play here. And if we get onto Brexit, which I suspect we may, Convener, that's an issue that I would like to make there. The bigger the market, the higher the volume, the lower we can keep our prices, and the more secure is supply. So Liz Woodson mentioned some comparative data with other countries. I mean, we commissioned just over a year ago the economics consultancy Oxera to look at how the market worked in the UK and compare it with other European countries. Their results, and I should say we asked Ms Woodson's team which countries they'd like us to compare against, so we didn't cherry pick the basket that we compared against. The result of that work is that we are the lowest priced of comparable countries in Europe and the United States, as I think Mr Stewart mentioned. And that is a difference between 25% higher in the otherwise lowest priced European countries to up to 700% higher in some of those comparable countries. So on pricing overall, and we can talk, I'm sure, we will, about specific products, but on pricing overall, prices controlled by competition produces a better outcome from the payer than the more interventionist government-led systems that we see in the rest of Europe. Coming on to attractiveness and availability and accessibility of medicines for patients, you then pose the questions, if prices are so low in the 4 home nations, why are we an attractive market? Well, we're an attractive market because there are low levels of government intervention. Once we have a license from the MHRA, we can launch the product. In other European countries, you need different stages of approval, be it for reimbursement or equivalence, and that takes time, it takes money. And we're attractive, frankly, because we are a member of the European Union and we don't have to go through separate procedures for the 4 home nations than we do for the 27. So both in terms of overall price, individual products notwithstanding, we can come back to, and making the market attractive notwithstanding that price, then we think the system that we have for unbranded generics works very well indeed. There are some shifts around the edges between branded and unbranded generics that we'd like to make, but overall we think the position is very positive. And that's frankly not me praising the industry, it's me praising regulators and successive governments that have understood that message and have set the market in the way it works effectively.
Thank you very much. Martin Sorr.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting us. As you know, we represent the larger wholesalers and distributors across all 4 countries of the UK. And we don't have a role in any price negotiations statutorily, but obviously we're the recipients of how price regulation works or doesn't work. And I really would echo the earlier comments that the flexibility of the pricing regulation schemes, both branded and generic, have provided a lot of resilience, perhaps, you may be surprised to hear, in the supply chain, unlike some of the other European countries where tendering and fixed pricing is involved, and they are now experiencing some worse shortages than actually the UK. And I think the flexibility, for example, that generic prices can rise in that market allows a bit more resilience because new products and, well, new manufacturers will enter the market. So certainly we're very supportive of the flexibility that has been created, but also within the supply chain, that flexibility creates incentives to purchase, because as wholesalers, we try to get the best deal from the manufacturers because we own most of the products that we distribute. And likewise, pharmacies use wholesaler competition to try and buy and purchase in the most attractive way based on the reimbursement prices they're going to get. So we certainly think incentives, again, within the supply chain provide across the UK a lot of competition, and it's that volume that is important to keep it going. But certainly we're very supportive of the current schemes.
Clearly, we heard in the previous evidence session there are some issues around some generic medicines and the possibility of some intervention there. From what you've said, you would clearly have issues with that, but in general, the current system effectively does what manufacturers and wholesalers want it to do, as well as from the NHS point of view.
And if I may, Convener, I would say delivers for the NHS and for patients too. And I think if we look at some of the high prices for specific products that have been mentioned, and I think there's possibly up to 9 competition law investigations, though I think 2 or 3 of those that the CMA has withdrawn from. We will be the first organisation to criticise manufacturers if there is any form of malfeasance behind those prices. I think it is wrong to assume that just because there's been a significant price rise, it's unjustified. It may be justified, and if you wish, we can go into some of the reasons. But it is right that there are powers for the government to get the data, to investigate those. And we did actually welcome the enhanced powers that the UK government took in that regard, because frankly it is in no interest of my members to have occasional products which look as if there is something wrong without any way of dealing with that.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Yeah, good morning to the panel. Contained within the new price regulation scheme for branded drugs is a commitment that pharmaceutical companies will offer the same price for product across the whole of the UK. And we heard from Cancer Research UK some evidence, albeit anecdotally, that is not the case, and there is certain discrepancies for new drugs. And I wonder if is that something that you recognise?
That question will be for me, Ms Whittle. So what we have within the new VPAS arrangement, the voluntary arrangement that Elizabeth described, is we also have a clause where there is not only transparency across the 4 nations, but we in ABPI encourage our members to give every 4 nation the same arrangement. And so that's quite clearly within the new VPAS arrangement. Within these arrangements, you have maybe, though, a few different kind of wheels going at the same time. So you'll have price will be obviously a major element of that, but you also maybe have the collection of data. You may also have what we don't have in Scotland, and I think it's important, and it's not anything that national procurement can do anything about, but it might be something this committee wants to look at recommending, is that they are, for example, in England, working within a system where uptake has forged actually one of the major planks of the voluntary arrangement. So it's not just access to medicines, so that means it's got through, for example, in our case, SMC. It's also that they are seeking to understand, support, and actually promote the use of the new innovative medicines. So that therefore gives the companies a kind of different package, perhaps in one country from another. So that's one example. But generally speaking, we do encourage our members to give the same arrangements, but you've also got to work within that each country still wants to keep its own, if you like, sovereignty on what it does for its own medicines and how they get accessed within the country. So you've got these tensions going on. But generally speaking, I think national procurement do a very good job in getting my members to give them the best price possible, even if they're not perhaps doing the other aspects.
I guess then to understand that whether that process is working or not, there has to be a monitoring system in place that can measure that. So where do we sit? Where do we sit with how it's monitored?
I think you'd have to. I think basically the different procurement departments within the United Kingdom will basically be sharing that information. From an ABPI perspective, we don't keep that information, and but we still encourage that the members will basically have a flat playing field, and but it will depend upon the arrangement that the company comes to with the particular nation that they're dealing with.
Thank you very much. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to come on the back of Brian Whittle's question with regards to VPAS and the triad and looking towards outcomes and payments for results, basically, and what, going forward, you think that should look like? Because I think that then starts to answer some of the questions Brian put forward there around how do you actually monitor.
Absolutely. And coming back to your point earlier on, Mr. Briggs, about the, and I know that you chair the cross-party cancer group, and there we have been asking for many years for the data to be improved. And as Denning, the statistician, said, in God we trust, and everybody else bring data. And that's because we desperately need this data. We've moved into a whole new world of data where patients themselves will have it on their wrists, will be keeping all sorts of information about their health, and we want to tap into that to look at the outcomes. So, for example, you could have the situation, so I do get worried when we get too tied up about, let's say, just price rather than value. So if Mrs. McKerricker has a £1 inhaler and that keeps her asthma or COPD here, but if she was to get the new inhaler and she can now climb stairs and she isn't getting blue lighted into hospital, that is a whole other value that's been brought in for that medicine. And because we're not collecting the data between primary and secondary care where she's being blue lighted into doesn't actually know what inhaler or what intervention or why she's not being blue lighted. So we need to be able to collect the data so we know the outcomes. And I think we would like the government to really get behind this and to implement what came out of the data scoping task force. And that was looking at indications, looking at outcomes, and then we'll be able to see whether our medicines are doing what we say they're going to do, whether the right patients are getting them, and going into the future of pricing of medicines and basically the whole kind of gene therapy, which, we can go to the Scotsman this morning about exciting, new research with the CAR-T therapies. We need the data to identify patients and to know that we're getting the right outcomes and the value for the money that's being spent on medicines.
Briefly again.
Topic of mine. We talk a lot in here, we've heard a lot of evidence over a number of years around the need to collect data, about the need to have a platform that allows patient data to be not only collected but shared seamlessly. And we hear all the time that this is what's required. Frustration, of course, for this committee is it's not happening. So where are we with that? Why is it not happening?
This is something that I've been working on for over 20 years. 25 years ago, I worked on geographically mapping disease, and it's frustrating that we have had the CHI number for so long, and yet we haven't really made the most of it. So again, we would perhaps ask this committee to look at whether the government should be putting more resource and commitment to make this all come to fruition, because we really don't have time to wait for this to come forward. We've got new therapies that need the data so that we know where the patients are that can get the best use out of the medicine. So we're as frustrated probably as this committee is, but we absolutely need the government to prioritise this just as they prioritise other areas. Because in fact, if we go back to Andrew Morris's data scoping task force, one of the lines in it, which I think crystallised it all, was that with data, you save time, you save money, and you save lives. And so that's why it's so important that the Scottish Government actually put more resource and put basically their attention into this as they would any other significant priority. But if I could just clarify that from an industry perspective, we aren't seeking the data so that we can drill into this on a kind of named patient basis. We're looking for aggregated, anonymised data from an industry perspective, but we need the NHS to have the data so that they know that they're getting the right medicine, the right patient at the right time.
And one more brief supplementary, Sandra White.
Sorry, just a brief supplementary. The last paragraph that you mentioned about an industry perspective is absolutely important. But also what's really important, we've had evidence here in this committee, is change of culture. We have GPs. It's not as simple as saying Scottish Government will put resources or do whatever, regardless of anything else. We need the GPs to come on board, because patients tell us, the public tell us that the data should belong to them. and not just. So I think it's oversimplified when you say put resources in, because we need the GP to come on board, and the pharmacists want to work along that way, but we do have these stumbling blocks. Now, I just wondered if you agree with me in that respect.
Absolutely, Mrs. White. So basically, when you look at the first realistic medicine report that came out, in it, Catherine Calderwood stated that it takes a whole generation for Scotland to adopt innovation. That is just not fast enough. When you look at the fantastic stuff that's going on just now, we want the uptake to be driven faster than that. But you're right, there is a culture in Scotland that we'll just wait and see. And also there's a bit of a culture that people are scared. I found it interesting talking to people at health boards that they didn't know. And in fact, if you look at the submissions from health boards into the inquiry, very few times, if at all, is the arrangement with industry actually mentioned. So they're worried that they're spending vast amounts of money and they don't seem to appreciate that this 2% cap's there and they're going to get the money back. So I don't know if that's something we need to do to work on to get people to appreciate that that they shouldn't demonise progress. We've got to get it moving, otherwise Scotland's going to lose out, and we'll lose out also from an innovative perspective, because we need to be an innovative nation, especially going forward, that can attract investment. Right now we've got huge investment from the pharmaceutical industry in Scotland at £2.5 billion, and a lot of thousands of jobs, but we need to keep ourselves there. So I absolutely agree on the cultural piece, and I'm not sure what we can do to help you there, but if there is anything we can do, we're all ears.
Clearly a wider conversation there, but that's a very useful start. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you. I'm interested in issues around drug shortages and not necessarily Brexit related, because I think colleagues will ask questions around that. We've had medicine shortages, for various reasons previously, and some of the medicines listed were antidepressants and painkillers, as well as I am aware of a fire in a factory in India that led to an antibiotic clarithromycin shortage. So there's issues, but that hikes up prices, and then there's issues around community pharmacists having to source medicines or alternatives that increases the prices, and then there has to be ways where the community pharmacists are reimbursed for that. Can you explain a little bit about why we have shortages, and then what can we do to, I guess, solve any problems created?
Thank you very much for that. It's a complex issue. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. We track from our members their performance in meeting orders from their customers, which is one way of gauging the market as a whole. Our feeling at the moment is that we are broadly in the mid-range of supply. So we measure on time in full deliveries. When it's bad, it's mid-70s. When it's good, it's low 90s. We're currently mid-80s. So we think we're in that broad range of normal. And as someone in supply chain said to me, every shortage has its own story. There are, however, I think, some factors which apply at the moment which probably haven't applied previously, and that will be having an effect certainly on some products. So we are seeing the Chinese government moving manufacturers of chemical plants, including manufacturers of active pharmaceutical ingredient, from urban areas to rural areas for environmental reasons. That's not being done in a phased way. They close a factory, they go build another one. There's a gap. We have seen the introduction of the Falsified Medicines Directive in Europe, which means every pack has to have a unique serialised number on it. That has slowed production lines by about 10%. So that has taken capacity out of the manufacturing chain. We have seen, due to downward pressure on price, the manufacture, particularly of active pharmaceutical ingredient, the chemical that makes the drug work, shift from traditionally Spain and Italy to India and now China. We're seeing more manufacturing in India. You mentioned the fire in India. We've seen shortages caused by Mumbai dockers going on strike. So we've had a series of issues where the supply chains have got longer and thinner and are probably therefore less resilient than they may have been in the past. I would say quite often if you see a price increase here, that's a success, not a failure, because that allows the manufacturer to bear additional costs and remain in the market and get the medicine to patients. If you look across Europe where there are fixed prices and manufacturers can't increase, they tend to withdraw from the market. So at the moment, the DHSC shortages list, I think, has 78 products on it. The Swiss list, I think, has 600 on it. So that inherent flexibility, albeit at the cost of a short-term increase in price, can keep medicines flowing to patients. And again, I think the last point I'd make on that, the work by Oxera that I mentioned earlier, showed that when there is a spike in prices to cope with that sort of shock to supply, we are typically 75% of those products are back to the normal price within 12 months. Again, as we get back to normal, competition kicks in and the price comes down. But my overall message is that price increase can be the market working to ensure the supply of medicines to patients.
And the UK government bears the brunt of the increase in price because they help support the community pharmacists with mitigating these price increases.
They do, and we, the UK government and community pharmacy has done a lot of work, and indeed wholesalers represented by Martin have done a lot of work to make that system more efficient. We welcome the fact, for example, that the UK government has taken powers to require actual prices to be given to them within 48 hours. In the past, frankly, it was just our members that did it on a voluntary basis. So that information is available, and I know that the UK government has looked at different ways of using those data so that community pharmacy is properly reimbursed for the charges that it faces.
Martin, sorry.
In spite of, we totally agree that any patient having to wait for a medicine is one patient too many, but I do feel, in spite of the headlines, we're in a better place than we were perhaps 10 years ago in the UK when shortages began to impact. And I think a lot of that has been down to as Warwick says, better communication with the NHS. So we provide a lot more data now to the NHS. Actually, ironically, Brexit planning has helped that the last 2 years, because the government has a much better understanding of the supply chain and where product is. So I do feel that the NHS is better armed to communicate internally within the NHS, which I know they do now on a monthly basis, a list of products that are in short supply and when they might come back. But as the sector that sort of has to deal with the symptoms of not being able to get enough medicines that we want to supply to pharmacies, hospitals and dispensing doctors, we have got much better IT systems, management and controls in stock taking every 24 hours, being able to ship product around the country overnight to where it's actually needed. We have, I think the committee's been supplied with an infographic that we've now in the process of giving out to every pharmacist to try and explain to them the reasons for a shortage. And as Warwick says, every medicine has a story, because a shortage in one product is not necessarily the reason for a shortage in another. So I do feel, again, part of what will help is communication, a bit more transparency, and I think we're starting to see that. We're also working with pharmacy PMR providers to try and develop a much better system of the coding they get given to tell them why they haven't got a product and when they might be able to get it back in stock. Because a lot of the problem is a poor pharmacist with a patient doesn't really know when the medicine's going to come, why it's not there, and that can take some time for the information to be communicated, and we're trying to make sure that's a bit quicker.
Is there any particular group or types of drugs that are more prone to shortage? I heard a Radio 4 programme recently that talked about hormone replacement therapy meds that were in a shortage, and antipsychotic drugs as well. So is there any predictor that we have with what types of drugs that are like flashing red lights that you know you have to keep an eye on?
Thank you, Convener. we believe, and it's frankly it's difficult for us to get to the root cause, and we are doing some work with industry colleagues and with the UK government to try and improve this. We believe HRT is down to the Chinese API issue I mentioned, where we believe 2 suppliers of estrogens have been closed down and haven't yet recommenced supply, but it is very difficult to pinpoint specific issues. So at the moment, for example, there are 2 products where the regulators have found a potential impurity in the manufacturing process, and in one of those that's been withdrawn from the market because there are alternatives. So sometimes it can be a safety issue, and you can't predict, I'm afraid, where they are going to come from.
Martin, sir.
I would say that having been managing symptoms for some time, I think now we've started to exhaust the different levers that we do have, and I do think a more strategic review of perhaps the origination of API, as the BGMA has mentioned, and I know at a European level there is a more strategic review of perhaps consolidation in manufacturing may have gone too far, and that we need a bit more resilience in manufacturing going forwards, and that might mean reshoring some manufacturers into Europe, back into Europe.
If I could just add to that, thank you, Convener. I think Martin's point is absolutely critical. We can deal with the symptoms, we need to focus and resolve the causes. Clearly, moving manufacturer finished form product out of the UK and the move of API manufacturers to the Far East does weaken the resilience of the supply chain. Perhaps if there is one glimmer of hope in a post-Brexit world, if you'll excuse a political comment, it may be that there could be some form of industrial strategy looking at the off-patent sector, because that will become increasingly difficult in a post-Brexit world potentially. And I think that is something that we are encouraging the UK government to look at, and I think there is some sympathy there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted, Martin Sawyer's already touched on this, but I wanted to ask some questions around the wholesale market, and you've already outlined the complex supply chains which we're seeing, but some of the written submissions which we received specifically from community pharmacists was around the increased amount of time they're spending in sourcing medicines. So I wanted to ask, is there ways of making the system more efficient? I believe in England and Wales there is more of a monitoring of where medicines are, and what would that look like in Scotland specifically?
Thank you for the question. I'm not aware of any monitoring that's different in England, Wales to Scotland. I certainly know that because of the Brexit work, we have a much better understanding of how much stock is around. It's the difficulty is to know is if it's in the right place at the right time, and I think that is the next challenge. As I mentioned previously, we are working with pharmacy bodies across the UK to try and, as wholesalers, communicate with them better. And some of that is about amending the PMR coding systems, because each system has its own different coding. So depending on which system the IT system the pharmacy uses, they get a different code sometimes. So we're trying to make it simpler. We're collaborating with the manufacturers on making sure the information we give them pharmacy is correct, and we're reducing the codes from something like 150 down to about 12. That's the plan, to make it simpler. So I think that's a concrete example of what we're trying to do, because it is about communication and information for the pharmacist.
And the work of the Central Medicines Intel Unit, do you think that could have a role then in terms of where actually medicines are and stocks are in terms of primary and secondary care?
I'm not, personally, and I think as our sector, we're not convinced that type of more interventionist management of supply will work. We've had historical issues with, pandemic planning, which you could say was more interventionist, and it has been expensive for the public purse. I think working with the private sector, as has happened with supply ever since the NHS was invented, is a much better way, because the private sector will find the gaps and will make sure, because they're incentivized, fill those holes much more quickly usually.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of a direct-to-pharmacy initiative then around the supply, that restricts quotas, is that right?
So direct-to-pharmacy, unfortunately, is a bit of a misnomer. There are only 5 direct-to-pharmacy schemes for the largest branded manufacturers, and in fact, one of them has just pulled back to traditional wholesale in the last 12 months. Wholesaling is where we buy the product, and that happens in the large majority of cases by volume. There are 4 manufacturers now who do DTP schemes where we actually get paid, because the wholesalers won all the contracts. We get paid a fee for distribution, and the pharmacist buys the product directly off the manufacturer, and they are quoted, yes, but a lot of other products that we own, we quote at the pharmacy, and some of the reason for that, unfortunately, is that we believe there are too many wholesale dealers' licenses out there. We have 2% of the wholesale dealers' licenses are members who distribute 90% of NHS medicines. There are a lot of wholesale licenses out there, small businesses who may not have wholesaling as their main business, but they can wholesale. And that means that sometimes there's product you don't know where it is. It does provide competition, though, because if there's a product short in a local area, that small wholesaler may be able to provide product. But there are, I think, a lot of unknowns in the supply chain, which we believe a bit greater transparency would help. We don't always know who we're selling to. We might sell to one business thinking it's a dispenser, but actually it's being used to wholesale. So that's one of the reasons we implement quotas. We do a lot of quoting on businesses who actually have a wholesale license.
Okay, thank you.
Just for clarity, that wholesale license is granted by whom?
The MHRA, but it's an EU regulation. So again, this might give us some greater flexibility, or the MHRA greater flexibility in 2021 going forwards, perhaps.
Yes, so it'll still be an MHRA responsibility, but the context in which it provides that license will change.
Correct.
Thank you very much. David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Panel, you would have heard my questions in the last session about Brexit. So my very general question is, how confident are you in the security supply of medicines post-Brexit?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I was hoping you'd come back. It's something that concerns us on 2 levels. I mean, I mentioned in answer to the convener's first question that volume is important to the operation of the generic industry. If we have to undertake a different regulatory process for the UK compared with the EU 27 after the end of this year, that will make life much more difficult and much more expensive for us. And given that the UK is the lowest priced market in Europe, that would bring into significant doubt our ability to continue to supply medicines, certainly at the current prices, and if at all. The MHRA and certainly the UK government as a whole is aware of this, and I think Liz Woodson mentioned some of the commitments that have been made by ministers. But I think it's important to recognise that any deviation at all from the EU 27 regulatory processes will add cost. So people have said to me, we can do it faster. That is not helpful. Companies will have a team working to a timetable. If they have to put additional resource into that team to deal with a different timetable, even if it's faster, that will add to cost. So we need to stick as closely as possible to the EU regulatory framework if we are to continue to supply the same volume of medicines at the same low price as we are now.
Okay, I'll bring up to the other panel members in a second. I mean, that's a very important point about price. Could I also raise the issue about timing? As you well know, one of the great successes of the EU is the frictionless borders among the 28 members. And you'll know that many pharmacies operate in a just-in-time model of supplying drugs. So frictionless borders and just-in-time go together. What doesn't go together is just-in-time and massive delays at customs points. What's your assessment of that in terms of the physical, putting price to one side, the physical supply and availability of drugs in the UK?
So first of all, Mr. Stewart, you're absolutely right. We launch first in the United States and second in the EU because they're the largest markets. It makes most commercial sense. We can treat more patients by launching in those markets than elsewhere, and that, I'm sure, will continue. A lot of work has been done on what's called the short straight crossing, so Dover-Calais, to you and me, in terms of no-deal Brexit planning. It now looks as if we're going to have a deal, and an implementation period or transition period, it will be necessary for manufacturers and their logistics suppliers fully to understand the new customs arrangements at the borders. And when we were looking at no deal planning, surveying my members, the weakest point was in their understanding of revised customs procedures when lorries turn up at Calais. There is still work to be done in that area. There needs to be people. You'll get the argument, well, it's all set up online, you just need to do it online. And we all know that sometimes that doesn't happen. And you get a truck full of medicines, turns up at Calais, it's got the wrong documentation, it's sent off to a lorry park while it's sorted out. That's not good for security, it's not good for temperature control, it's not good for just-in-time supply.
I think I would just add that as a representative body of the wholesalers in the UK, we are very concerned about what friction might bring to any medicine system, because we operate the 4 countries of the UK identically. We charge the same prices everywhere. We distribute to Scotland from England. We distribute to England from Scotland. We distribute to Northern Ireland from Scotland. So there's lots of, because of efficiencies, that's how it works. And therefore, any more barriers to bringing cost into the process we'd be very concerned about. I would say we have worked really closely, as has the BGMA and ABPI, with the Department of Health in London over the last couple of years on Brexit planning, and I know that is going to continue this year, because I think that's important that we all know what might be down the track and prepare for it, because there will be, again, preparation for December 31st this year in the same vein, I'm sure.
And Alison may want to come in the point I'm just about to make.
Sure.
I was quite surprised when I looked at some of the figures about imports. It's actually just about the same as our exports, which was quite interesting, which is 23 billion, but 75% of that comes from Europe. Now, at one level, business gurus, of which I'm not one, will argue that sometimes having too much dependency is a problem. So there's a change in relationship. But I think that's been a good relationship for Britain in terms of security, supply and price. But 75% is a really hefty amount of imports, and the rest of it is basically America, which, as you will know, basically comes through Europe in terms of customs and everything else. Do you have any concerns about that if there is a change? For example, tariffs, which obviously affects imports and exports.
So from an ABPI perspective, we too are looking for a frictionless border so our medicines can come straight in. It's quite interesting, actually. I read Spice's information about the 23 billion going each way. My information is that 45 million packs go out of the UK to Europe and 37 million come back in. So there's definitely a hook there for cooperation between Europe and the United Kingdom to try and ensure that our medicines come in without any friction. And I think ABPI has been very clear about the fact that we should be looking for cooperation when it comes to the supply of medicines coming in, academia. There's several workforce. So there's a lot of work to be done. And actually, I think it would be fair to report that we've worked very well with the Scottish government officials that were tasked with Brexit and the logistics of the supply of the medicines coming in, so they're not stuck at Dover. So we have looked at the logistics of medicines being flown in and other ways of getting them to the patients in Scotland.
Just move on, because I'm conscious again of time, is the issue with US trade negotiations. You had deferred again my earlier comments on that. So clearly we all know America is a very, very important market. It's also the home of Big Pharma, which I hadn't mentioned in the last question, which has a lot of power and influence. It tends to be a much more highly priced market. I did the comparison with the top 20. Maybe it was 5 times more than the UK. Is there any issues that you have with future relationships? We already have 20%, which is pretty solid. But have you any issues around price, security of supply, and the other issue, which I didn't raise last time, was about the issue of patent control, which is obviously vital when it comes down to cost as well.
So when it comes, what we are picking up, the signals that we've had from the UK are that medicines are not going to be on the table when it comes to the trade agreement with the US. I think it's fair to say that we already enjoy the benefit of very good American medicines coming into Scotland, and they go through our usual processes, be it the ultra-orphan process, SMC doing their clinical effectiveness, and national procurement basically negotiating. So we already get access to good medicines from America, and they go through the usual channels. They also are part of the voluntary arrangement, so again, the 2% back cap. So we've had the same kind of deals that we talked about earlier with the government over the past 60 years. We don't see them changing, and the American products are within that. So we think it's probably too early to speculate exactly what's going to happen. But the signals that we are getting should give us comfort that medicines are not on the table.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. I think, Mr. Stewart, we are most concerned about US objectives around intellectual property rights. And you mentioned patents, but a little more broadly than that. And there are, without going into the weeds, there are various provisions that USTR in all of the FTAs it negotiates tries to bring into those free trade agreements, which would delay the launch of generic and biosimilar medicines in the UK compared with the current European standards. That delay is potentially up to 2 years. So the savings that the NHS would get during that period would be lost, as well as obviously the impact on the industry not being able to launch. And I mean, I can speculate about numbers. You know, a blockbuster at say £400 million a year for the UK, so say 40 million for Scotland over 2 years. That could be £80 million lost on one product. So we are very concerned about intellectual property rights. We know that the Department of Health and Social Care within the UK government understands that and are very supportive of our position. We are concerned that we might be collateral damage in a broader political play from more senior levels.
For clarity, your concern is not so much about a specific price-related proposal from an American trade team. Yeah. It's about their approach to removing a medicine from a branded high-price category to a generic low-price category and changing the basis on which that was taken from.
Absolutely, Convener. And that is as much about data exclusivity, which is a technical provision in the licensing field. It may be about it. So in the US, a generic manufacturer has to notify the originator before they begin to work on the launch of a product. In the UK, frankly, if that happens, we normally end up in court. We get injuncted. That delays. So there are a range of features that we think US trade negotiators would try and seek, which we think would be damaging to our industry and to the NHS.
Thank you very much. Martin Sawer, do you want to add anything on that?
I don't think I want to add anything to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a quick sup on the issues. I suppose I should have asked the previous panel about guarantees for drug pricing or supply chains for Scotland, because trade is reserved, the negotiations are reserved to Westminster, but there's been secret meetings, and the Channel 4 Dispatches programme showed secret meetings between US drug firms and civil servants, and then there's been 6 meetings already about where drug pricing has been discussed. So I do seek comfort, and I seek guarantees probably that our drug pricing or the ability to have a supply chain that's stable won't be affected by Trump trade deal negotiations. So would you think we should be seeking guarantees also from the UK government?
Thank you. I can speak a little bit as a former UK government trade negotiator. I think the way in which those talks were characterised as secret talks is a little bit of hyperbole. I'd have been absolutely amazed if they hadn't gone on. I think all they do, if you look at the leaked minutes of them, is confirm that what was being discussed is what is already set out very clearly in the US negotiating objectives. So I don't think that is any more sinister than that, but it does underline the point I made earlier that these issues are on the table from the US side.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Again, David Torrance. George Adams, sorry.
All right, thank you.
There's been a quick
Good morning. Aye, that was it. Nobody noticed that. Good morning. I'd like to ask about, we were told by the Scottish Government that obviously the officials that branded products cost more, but there's less of them distributed when they're prescribing, and generics are, there's more of them, but they cost a lot less. So the generics market relies on competition, but there's examples of been price hikes in generics normally when one manufacturer effectively is doing it. So how do we create the competition to make sure that people are getting involved in that market and possibly bringing the costs down?
Thank you. So I think Mr. Adam, Liz Woodson mentioned that Department of Health and Social Care in London has been looking at ways to bring competition into the market where it doesn't exist. And I think in many ways a better way to differentiate the way we look at this issue is rather than branded versus unbranded, it's where competition is effective and where competition isn't effective. It's unfortunate that's not the way the different reimbursement schemes work at the moment. We are in discussion with the department in London about ideas they have to introduce competition. I'm bound to say we don't yet think either side has come up with anything which would be effective. And we may just have to acknowledge that for some products, it's unlikely that competition will be able to work. If the use across the 4 home nations in a year is less than 1 batch, it's really difficult to think how you'd have more than 1 manufacturer producing that medicine. And at first sight, some of the products that the department in London has been concerned about, and indeed where we've had shortages, tend to fall into that sort of category. And it may be that we just need to take and we're talking about small numbers here, it may be that we need to take a small number of products and recognise that unless there is systemic change elsewhere, then it will be really difficult to make competition work.
I was asking for a specific reason because I mentioned multiple sclerosis, which my wife had earlier on, and I'm aware of, there's a consultant I've met in Glasgow and works for Ayrshire board as well, and effectively he made an example, did a presentation that I've seen that shows that some Scandinavian countries have used generic drugs for people with multiple sclerosis, and the costs are phenomenally less as opposed to us using the branded products over here. And his argument was effectively, why aren't we looking at this? It actually has the same, it actually delivers the same as what we're paying for the branded product at the moment. So what would you say with regards to that type of argument coming from someone, well, a neurological consultant?
So I think the first thing I would say is Scotland has a very good record in introducing generics once they're available, once the intellectual property rights on the originator have expired. And I think the unbranded prescription number is 84%. I mean, there's a couple of percentage points maybe above that in Europe. The only country that's significantly above that is the US, where it is 90%. And frankly, I question whether that is clinically sound. I think that is driven predominantly by money, whereas we would want a clinical decision first and then a financial decision, and in that order. I think there is considerable scope, and this may be the point that your colleague mentioned to you, there is considerable scope to look at older medicines which can be repurposed for new uses. And we are doing a lot of work with NHS England in particular to look at ways of repurposing generic medicines. There are some barriers to this. A generic company might have to do some fairly basic research to get that new indication, that new disease added to the license. But once it is added, every generic company can market the product for that. So we need to get over that and work out just what data we need. But those discussions are well advanced, and there is, I think, positivity on each side of that discussion to find a way of dealing with those barriers. And I think that's quite exciting for the NHS and for the generic industry.
That sounds hopeful as well. One of the other things that I'd like to ask is, I asked this question earlier on with regards to branded products in particular. Basically, you'll have heard me saying earlier on, when the latest MS wonder drug comes up, the pharmaceutical company quite rightly makes its pitch for what this drug is, ends up in the media. People think it's a wonder drug, it's going to make a difference to people's lives, but it's not even been submitted to SMC or NICE at that point as well. How do we have that conversation, with the public and everyone else, and from you as the industry? How do you have that responsible conversation where we make sure that everybody is aware that we haven't actually got these products either tested or it's claims at that point?
From a generic point of view, the products we launch will already have been on the market for, say, 15 years. And Alison's members will have had to demonstrate the efficacy to the MHRA. I personally, this is very much a personal view, I quite like the restrictions we have on advertising and making claims in the UK. I think the work that the ABPI does on enforcing the code of conduct on its members, and we have a similar code, but we're probably less exposed, I think is effective. I would not want to be in the position, as I find when I'm having my hamburger in the Marriott in Washington at 7:30 at night, having TV adverts coming out badgering me to go and speak to my GP to get a new medicine, which I might know is no more effective than another one. So I think controls we have in the UK are better than in many other parts of the world, and I think are pretty well enforced both by the industry, principally the ABPI, and also the regulator.
Maybe just ask Alison as the ABPI person if you want to add anything on that.
I think it's important. I absolutely understand what you mean about the big flash headlines that can maybe raise expectations, and quite often they're very upstream. In fact, this morning's Scotsman one about the CAR-T therapies, that is just at university level just now. And so I think we've got to be responsible in how we basically, from a public relations perspective, give the information out to the journalists, but what they do that they're after, basically we tend to be hostages to what they do. But I think the point about the direct-to-consumer advertising, we as an industry are not allowed to talk directly to the patients. So we will rely, for example, on the Scottish Medicines Consortium patient representatives who will hear, the debate about why the medicine, what's good about the medicine, what's maybe still lacking in evidence. And usually it's representatives from, for example, very ably represented by the MS Society that have attended the SMC, and for them perhaps to be the conduit to the patients to try basically to manage expectations.
The reason why I'm asking is because as a husband and wife with MS, I just want to see her walk down the corridor. So if you see something like that come up, you automatically, but as a politician, someone that's been involved in this, I know how the process works, and it becomes to a situation where we say, how do we manage that expectation? Because it's a very emotional kind of the reason that we're dealing with here, and it's one of the concerns I have when you do see constantly, whether it be other conditions and everything else as well, you just constantly just see these big splash in the media, and we could all complain about the media, but unfortunately we've all got to work with them.
We do, and it's quite interesting. I was asking someone about, it was actually data in Finland, and how they managed to get people to buy into the fact that they've completely opened up their databases, and they say that in Finland, the media, they reckon, is just very responsible in how it reports, and people trust the media. And I don't want to demonise the media. They play a very important role in our society, and but I'm not sure that we have the answer to that, and maybe that's something we've got to put a bit of thought into from a communications perspective with our members, as to not to raise expectations, especially where there might be a very small cohort of patients that will be eligible, and yet everybody's hopes are up.
Finally, one of the issues that occasionally arises is where a drug is licensed for use with one condition but not with another. Are there things that should be thought about in terms of encouraging manufacturers to apply for licensing for different indications, or indeed licensing of product that isn't currently licensed in the UK?
Do you want me to answer that? When the manufacturers are looking to license, generally they're looking to look if there's an unmet need. So you're looking for an unmet need. You're looking to check that if you do the research here, that it's going to be accessible for patients. In other words, from our perspective in Scotland, that it get through the SMC, and that within that you also can broker in the cost of the breakthroughs of tomorrow. So it's quite a complicated area as to what you're going to, because it's going to cost you so much money to go for that. So basically, if you're going for another indication, if you take the whole drug's going to cost you over $1 billion to bring to market. That even if you're looking for another indication there, it's still going to cost you hundreds of millions. And so you've got to make sure that you're actually going to be able to get these kind of 3 factors satisfied before you would go down that line.
Just for clarity, how much would that additional licence
I think it will very much depend on what the indication is. So for some there would be very complex studies, and others you never know, it could be that they're quite straightforward. So I think, to be frank, that's probably how long's a piece of string. It'd be difficult to assess.
Thank you, Convener. If I could, I'd split your question into 2. So where there are no intellectual property constraints around the product, the answer I gave to Mr. Adam about repurposing, something that we're working on and hope to find a way forward. The other part of the answer is there may be products where there is an indication where the patent on the use exceeds the time of the patent on the molecule, and that there is quite an important case before the English Supreme Court at the moment. And I think once that's through, it will be down to us to find a way of dealing with that most effectively, that respects the rights of the originator, but actually helps the NHS with costs and the patient with access.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our witnesses again on this panel. That's been extremely helpful. Again, we've covered quite a lot of territory in quite a tight time frame, but if there are any other points you think we should consider on the back of your evidence session, then please do let us know. Thank you very much. Suspend briefly before going on to our third panel. everyone back for our third panel this morning, looking at the supply and demand for medicines, and again focusing on issues of access and procurement. I welcome to the committee Dr. Alan MacDonald, the chair of the Scottish Medicines Consortium, Lindsay McClure, Assistant Director, Medicines Pricing and Supply with NHS National Services Scotland, Matt Barclay, Director of Operations at Community Pharmacy Scotland, and Dr. Brian Montgomery, the author of the Review of Access to New Medicines. Welcome to you all, and I'll ask Emma Harper to begin our questioning on this panel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Panel 3. I'm interested in issues around pricing, and we've talked, or you've heard this morning about differences in pricing and tariffs and issues around that. I'm interested in what you think are the key drivers of growth in the medicines budget. And this morning we're talking about medicines, but we've seen a lot of increase in technology and consumables. Type 1 diabetics now have more pumps available, as well as technology for testing blood sugar, which keeps you out of hospital, hopefully, if we're monitoring that. So I'm interested in what you think are the key drivers for the growth in the medicines budget.
Who would like to start? Lindsay McClure.
Great. So I'm the lead pharmacist at NHS National Procurement. We centrally procure medicines for all NHS Scotland hospitals. We work across the full life cycle of medicines, so in-patent brands, generics, biosimilars, and we also can source unlicensed medicines to meet individual patient need. For example, if the medicine isn't yet licensed in the UK. We see different challenges across those areas. I think we've already heard earlier today that last year was a record year, so overall there's been a slight deflation in medicine spend. From a national procurement and a secondary care hospital perspective, the value of the medicines that we sourced last year essentially was around £400 million, and we managed to secure around 58 million in savings from that spend. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is around new medicines, so the hepatitis C medicines. Going back 5 years, there was a breakthrough in treatment. So we had a range of medicines entering the market that for the first time were able to cure hepatitis C, and without patients having to go through very difficult treatment courses with a lot of side effects. A challenge was affordability. So for a 3-month course, 3 packs of tablets, pricing initially was around £30,000 per patient. We worked very closely with clinical leads and boards, so there's a very tight hepatitis C clinical community. And in parallel to the tendering for the medicines, they developed clinical guidelines. Through those clinical guidelines, they said because the medicines were broadly very similar in clinical effectiveness, there were only minor differences between them, that the lowest cost medicine would be the one that would be first line in the guidelines. Strong incentive to industry. The consequences, we've had significant reduction in spend in that area. And we know that all the time there's new medicines coming to market, there's new pockets of competition. So that's something that we have to continue to repeat to control spend. Another example is biosimilars. So biosimilars are copies of biologic medicines. Biologic medicines are made from living organisms, so they are inherently a little bit variable, so from different cell lines. But the regulator has reviewed them, they've scrutinised, and they've said they've got comparable quality, safety, efficacy. The benefit is because they're a copy of a product that was on patent, where there wasn't competition, we've got for the first time competition and significant savings. In that area, we've worked very closely with boards to ensure implementation and uptake of the most cost-effective biologic products. And again, over the next few years, we'll have more of these products coming off patent. We're going to have to continue to work to make sure that we can control spend.
So I can really only answer this question as it relates to medicine spend, which I think is where Lindsay is coming from also, rather than as you've mentioned, devices and other things that promote to good health care. We've heard quite a bit, both in the submissions and from ABPI, about the extent to which medicines costs are rising or stable, both in absolute terms and in relative terms compared to the overall health budget. And sometimes it's quite hard just to get a single version of the truth as to how much things are rising, but we've had discussion and debate around that. The drivers to increase costs and the potential offsets are obviously complex. I think it is clear that in terms of a driver for increased costs, new medicines, hospital-based medicine are contributing
quite substantially to that. But there are offsets, and again, just to highlight what Lindsay has said here, I think the biosimilar issue has been a good news story for the NHS in Scotland and indeed in the rest of the UK. In my day job, I'm a rheumatologist, so I've seen this day to day, and clinicians working with finance and pharmacy have really done a lot to ensure that the savings from biosimilars have been used, A, to mitigate some of the upward pressures and costs, and B, to improve service.
Thank you very much. I think the crux of what lies behind your question, Ms Harper, is really the challenge posed by the success in recent years of providing healthcare. I have recently retired, but certainly over my career, I did see a sustained increase in the resource available to us when we were providing healthcare. But what has outstripped that resource are the options open to us as we look to provide treatments. We're now dealing with a situation where we have tests and treatments that weren't available 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We're dealing with diseases that weren't available or weren't around 5 and 20 years ago. And Lindsay's example of hepatitis C is a very good one indeed. When I started off, hepatitis C wasn't even known as a disease. It then emerged as a disease that we could do very little, pretty well nothing about, and now we can cure it. And what that does is give patients and clinicians many more choices, many more options, but what it does is put much greater pressure on the resource that is available. So I think behind that there is the challenge to us about how we prioritise where we see the best and most effective spend of the limited resource, the finite resource that is available. There is also something about how we spend the money that we've got to best effect, most effectively and most efficiently. And one of the things that I don't think we could ever claim is that we're always using every penny to absolute best effect. And then I think there is also an issue which again is particularly pertinent within medicines about how we can minimise the waste that is there. So I think unfortunately what we're dealing with is a challenge that is about being able to do more for people, extend life in a way that gives them much greater quality, but that quality comes at a cost and comes often at a requirement for ongoing input.
We're also seeing the transfer of, I guess, the budget for medicines from secondary care to primary care as well, because the Hep C patients are now treated in secondary care, and so the budget shift is going to be reflected that way as well.
Mark Barkley.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point actually, Ms Harper, in terms of community pharmacy. Wants to remain the port of call for the vast majority of supplies, obviously within primary care, and that shift of medicines from secondary to primary care has happened in the case of Hep C. Actually, we do supply Hep C through community pharmacy, and the evidence shows that thanks to community pharmacy supply, the outcomes for those patients in terms of the eradication within that patient population is actually greater, because community pharmacy are basically monitoring the uptake of these highly expensive medicines. It does come not without challenges for community pharmacy in a financial sense. We obviously procure medicines on behalf of the NHS. They sit in our shelves, so if a patient doesn't use a 5-figure box of hepatitis C, a pharmacy can be left with that. So it does come with challenges in terms of pharmacy, and within that there's probably a network of how pharmacies maybe use their stock best within a primary care setting. But I think broadly, pharmacy still wants to be at the forefront of medicine supply, and moving those medicines out from secondary to primary care, mentioned biosimilars as well, is something that has happened in pockets in community pharmacy as well. And that's something that we would certainly endorse, to build on, I suppose, the 100 million plus medicine interventions we make in a year, but we realise that the shape of medicine supply is changing. The type of medicines, the stratified, the personalised medicines in community pharmacy is going to have to adapt. Because you mentioned at the start about where is the drug spend happening in terms of growth, and I think without a doubt it is in these innovative areas, and these branded medicines. The generic supply is relatively well controlled and has in fact came down in the last year. So I think it's within that area that we probably need to focus.
Thank you very much. Can I move on to starting, I guess, triggering with innovative medicines. And clearly one of the things we've asked is around the processes for approval of drugs and medicines by the SMC and more widely. And while broadly there's a view that most of the submissions are positive about the appraisal process, there have also been a couple of concerns raised, and I would like to ask Al MacDonald, but also any other witnesses around those. One is an erosion of the robustness of the processes, whether that be under pressure from government, indeed from members of parliament, or from other external bodies. And secondly, a centralisation of approvals where currently, and this will be of interest to Lindsay McClure, I guess, as well, where currently area drug and therapeutic committees have a good deal of autonomy or decision-making powers, and where there's a sense that that may be under some pressure. So I'd be interested in comments on those 2 points. Alan MacDonald.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, and just, I suppose, with reference to Dr. Montgomery's report, the first conclusion of Dr. Montgomery's report was that SMC had delivered in the policy aim of increasing access to medicines for rare condition and cancer access. And I suspect that increase in access to cancer medicines and rare condition medicines is probably what's been driving some comments about whether this is affordability or whether there has been in some way any weakening of the process. So I'd really like to take this opportunity from an SMC point of view of absolutely refuting any notion that the process of HTA in Scotland has been eroded or weakened. I actually just don't believe that's correct. I think anybody who has witnessed our processes, who has sat round our table, who has listened to the quality of discussion and debate, the quality of the work in the background. I've been chair for the last 3 years, vice chair for the 3 years before that, and a member for 7 years before that, and at no time have I ever thought that the process was being carried out with anything but the utmost in rigour. People can judge whether the outcomes, the desired outcomes, whether access is too high. People can debate that, and they should debate that. But in terms of the process of how we work, I would absolutely refute any notion that it is done with anything other than complete rigour. And rigour in applying the criteria of clinical and cost effectiveness, which are within your remit. Yeah, absolutely. And just again, if I can pick up on comments that were made in previous sessions, I think it was from Mr. Adam around MS drugs, and how do you have a debate about this? I think one of the things that is missing from the public debate is that people, perhaps quite reasonably, don't get much beyond the decision. Is it accepted or is it not recommended? Sometimes the debate will go around the cost, which of course is one side of the coin, but rarely does the debate go to what actually is SMC's unique selling point, is that we're the only body in this space that is actually looking completely independently at the evidence and actually trying to say, is this better than what we've got? Is it a little bit better than what we've got? Or is it a lot better than what we've got? And I think sometimes in the public debate as to what we do, our role in actually critically and using the best evidence we can to try and make that comment as to how much really does this add to therapies we've got. Sometimes that bit of what we do, I think, gets lost in this whole public debate.
Thank you very much. Lindsay McClure.
Just from a pricing perspective, so we've already talked this morning, I know there's been a few questions around the voluntary scheme for branded medicines, the clauses that are now in there around transparency. So there is provision for purchasing authorities in one part of the UK to share confidential pricing information with another part of the UK, and also comparability. So if a manufacturer was to provide a better deal to another part of the UK, the provision for comparable arrangements to be offered to other home countries. That is a very important safeguard, so we're delighted to see that in the VPAS agreement. It is in the process of being implemented. I think we do have some way to go to make sure that's fully implemented. I think that needs to continue to be a priority to ensure in Scotland we do have a safeguard so that if we make different access decisions to England, we're not paying higher prices.
Okay. Brian Montgomery?
Yes, thanks. I've very little to add in terms of what's currently happening, but I would like to just pick up some of the points that Dr. MacDonald made. When I did my review, I was absolutely of the view that SMC was not broken. The thing that did concern me at the time that I did the review, though, was that there were a number of examples of where SMC was saying that it wasn't recommending a drug for use, but that drug was still finding its way into use via a number of alternative routes. And my concern at that time was that because of these alternative routes, we were at risk of actually undermining the robustness of the SMC processes. And hence some of my recommendations were how we might bring in other considerations for the very small number, and it is a fraction in terms of SMC's total workload, but for the small number of drugs for very rare and unusual conditions. And certainly my feeling, particularly having read the papers that were presented for this meeting, is that the actions taken have given us a modified situation that has not compromised SMC, but actually has put a little bit more flexibility in, which has improved the access, the direct access for people, rather than as it was previously, the access by a circuitous route.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Sandra White.
Thank you, Convener. And it's just after morning, so I'll say good afternoon. And I should have said previous as well, thank you very much for the written submissions that everyone has sent in. They're very, very interesting and very helpful. I want to really pick up on the procurement and the community pharmacies. And I know that Matt and I have spoken, or Matt Barkley and I have spoken about this in many occasions in that respect. And some of the submissions that we did receive actually, highlighted the increasing time that community pharmacies are spending on procuring medicines from wholesalers. That's one point. And it was also mentioned that more expensive branded drugs, I think it's already been mentioned, like Hep C treatments, etc., are once being prescribed, still being prescribed in hospitals, but are actually being prescribed by community pharmacies also. And basically, the system isn't, basically reimbursing community pharmacists for this, and the procurement model, with some of the submissions that were sent in, means that they're taking a greater, community pharmacists, taking a greater financial risk when they are procuring these products. So I just wanted to pose two questions to yourselves. How can community pharmacy procurement be made more efficient? Can it be, or is it efficient enough? Is there a role for, I think it's maybe a wee bit more controversial, is there a role for NHS national procurement to procure on behalf of community pharmacies? So I'll just throw that out, and Matt will be the first, I think.
Matt Barkley first, thank you.
Yes, thanks. I'll take that up, Sandra. Thanks. Yeah, I think there's two things that you asked there in particular. The first point around the amount of time that's spent by community pharmacy teams to get the medicines to patients in a timely manner, because we, of course, are presented with prescriptions from prescribers, primarily GPs, but there are a number of prescribing healthcare professionals out there. We have a statutory obligation to get that to them in terms of our terms of service in a timely manner. The wholesale model has changed. It actually was the first area where it kind of got me politically active in this area when I was a full-time practising pharmacist. I do still practice occasionally at the weekend to keep my hand in, but it was the first time I ever wrote to my local MP, as I realised it was a reserved issue at that time, to ask about the first direct-to-pharmacy scheme that was mentioned at the other one. So I did have an interest in this, and it probably piqued my interest to the point where I'm sitting here in front of you today talking about all this. But it's part of the day job now, essentially, unfortunately, for community pharmacy teams. It's a reality that we've had to bear. It's unfortunate because it takes the pharmacy team and the pharmacists away from the job of actually providing face-to-face care more than they would actually like, because there are a number of circuitous routes that molecules and commodity medicines can come to community pharmacies, and quite often through these pharmacy systems and quotas, etc., it can take longer than we would like. But I think now, as I say, it's part of the day job. Unfortunately, I think when the first scheme started in 2007, the genie was probably out of the bottle then. It's quite hard to put it back in. So I look back very much in the good old days of when you could just press a button in your pharmacy computer and it would just come in from
your main wholesaler, and that those days are gone. But I think pharmacies do deal with it. They deal with it efficiently. I don't think, in my experience, that patients wait any longer really for medicines now than they would have then. I think to your second point around the nature of the medicines that we're procuring and the cost of them, that is a challenge for pharmacies, as I say. We've had discussions with Lindsay, certainly at National Procurement, about ways that that can be supported, and the wider, I suppose, NHS Scotland systems. Because, I mean, pharmacies are traditionally paid, and, you know, the packages that we are paid for are traditionally just pounds rather than tens of thousands of pounds. So for pharmacies to be procuring these medicines, it does come at great financial risk. We want to do it because, for the whole reasons that I've pointed out, especially if we just pick up Hep C again as the example, to be part of the eradication strategy for Hep C in terms of through community pharmacy supply, and if we were to eradicate that, that would be a tremendous success story for patients, for NHS Scotland, and for community pharmacy to be part of that. I do believe that we just need to be supported, because the ways that our reimbursement system work at the minute, we tend to be paid, for example, 2-3 months in arrears through the NHS systems, whereas suppliers are wanting 30-day terms from us, for example. So quite often we are paying for these medicines before we're even reimbursed. There are systems where we can ask health boards to pay up front for significant supplies. They're quite clunky. As I say, we're working with NHS Scotland. We've had discussions with Lindsay before around this, so there are discussions going on in the background. But for us, I suppose, to take on more risk with more of these medicines, which ultimately we want to do because we want to supply them through community pharmacy, we probably just need to look at how that reimbursement system can work.
Specifically on specialty medicines and community pharmacies, I think we have been working with Community Pharmacy Scotland, with a whole range of stakeholders, including the ABPI, to try and support moving these products. A whole range of challenges, so I think supply chain. So when you've got a product that's £10,000 per pack, the normal distribution route might not be appropriate. Also got pricing challenges. So these are products that are traditionally secondary care. We have had very confidential discounts that have enabled patient access to medicines. So we've had to put in place different systems with manufacturers to ensure correct reconciliation of pricing back to the NHS. A big problem that's outstanding is around the cash flow challenges for community pharmacies of handling these medicines. So another part of my organisation, National Services Scotland, responsible for prescription payment, is working on trying to introduce faster payments. I think we've got some proposals that are under development at the moment. So I think we do have work to do, but it is going in the right direction. On your broader challenge around should we move to central procurement of medicines, generally, my personal view is no, because the system is working really well at the moment. So I think we've already heard this morning that on generic medicines, there is evidence that the UK has amongst the lowest prices in Europe. So the system does work well, and it can achieve the same results as central tendering. There could be use cases, though, where it might be an option worth considering. So, for example, flu vaccines. Back in 2016-17, we moved from community pharmacy procurement of flu vaccines to central procurement and distribution. Range of reasons for that. A key reason was around security of supply. So, vaccines are predominantly made through complex egg-based production methods. Every year, something can and does go wrong. So having central procurement allowed us to split our business across multiple suppliers to make sure we had more resilience. It gave us central oversight, so we knew where the vaccines were at any point in time, and the ability to control, so to introduce quotas to ensure that if there was a delay in a vaccine coming from a manufacturer, we can ensure fair distribution across the country. So might be very specific use cases, but generally no.
And generally, it's your view that the medicines, the price of medicines in the broad sense, is competitive, and is even where perhaps in some cases there might be an argument that said the price paid is higher than the value of the drug, but it's still as good a price as the market will deliver.
Yeah, so in the round and all the kind of international evidence, that's what it's telling us.
Thank you very much. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted a brief supplementary on that, because I know, and colleagues around the table will have individual cases depending on where we're coming from health boards and access to non-routine medicines. and PAX 2. And I would say, given my experience, there is a postcode lottery in Scotland when it comes to access some of these medicines. Would you agree with that?
Alan MacDonald.
So I guess the purpose of SMC is first and foremost to ensure that we promote access to medicines for the people of Scotland where we can, and at a price that represents good value for money. So our existence alone should, to a large extent, work against any notion of postcode prescribing. So if SMC decisions are implemented, that really goes against postcode prescribing and helps prevent that. PAX Tier 2 obviously was introduced as a process to allow individual requests. That is, and it's important that there be a process to allow individuals to access medicines because there may be specific systems. PAX Tier 2 obviously operates out with SMC, and how it is operated across the boards is probably not something I can easily comment on at this point.
PAX 2, that's the point I'm making.
Yeah, exactly how each board might apply the principles of PAX Tier 2, it's possible that they may look at it differently. Ultimately, of course, there is a national review panel that can look at any challenges.
And has that? Sorry.
I think Brian wanted to come in on that point.
Hopefully this will help address your question. My experience relates really to the situation before the introduction of PAX Tier 2, but I think the principles that we're trying to address remain the same, which is that Scottish Medicines Consortium basically is making population-based decisions. And the reason for having PACs and IPTR, as it was previously, was to give individuals an opportunity to find out if there were individual circumstances over and above the population considerations that might mean that that individual could therefore access the medicine. I guess the crucial word in there is around individual. And the difficulty is that while it's often portrayed as postcode prescribing, the reality is that the same principles are applied by health boards to a completely different set of individuals, and therefore you are going to see differing consequences from that. I think what PAX was aiming to do, and I believe there is some evidence that it's doing it, is to try and reduce the variation beyond the individuality, if I can put it that way. But I haven't actually seen the data yet to show just how effective PAX 2 has been.
And in terms of the National Appeals Panel, is there any outlying health boards you know at the minute who more appeals are being presented from?
Sir, to
maybe
that question.
Have a look at that. I wanted to move on to an issue which was raised earlier around non-pharmaceutical alternatives and specifically prescriptions not being the first thing. So in terms of, we're all aware of the work around type 2 diabetes. Where do you see that developing in the future? We've done some work around social prescribing, lifestyle coaching, and where actually that could be data-driven and captured as well to see the value of a non-pharmaceutical intervention.
Matt Bartlett.
Yes, I certainly see social prescribing supporting one of the things that I've probably talked to the committee about before as part of the primary care review in terms of referral pathways. I think the minute you have an element of social prescribing, you probably have more communication between other healthcare professionals, social groups, communities groups. I think that can be an enabler to support that within for patients and for communities. So interesting that you mentioned the data, and I know it's been brought up in previous panels as well. Again, community pharmacy as an endpoint for many of the supplies, whether that be through the medical or you know, not at the minute, but certainly in the future, hopefully social prescribing as well, could be an excellent area or asset that could be used to capture that data, because we obviously give medicines to patients. And if that can all be, I suppose, aligned alongside the medical intervention and the social, then yeah, that's certainly something we'd be interested in looking at further.
MacDonald.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously our remit only extends to medicines, so other important issues, devices, social prescribing, etc., are not primarily our business. However, it does speak a little bit to the previous discussion about VPAS implementation and uptake of innovative medicines, which we've heard a little bit about from Alison Culpin and others earlier. And it perhaps is our advice is permissive, so when we approve a medicine, we're saying this would appear to be a drug that could be used cost effectively in Scotland. It does not mandate its use. It doesn't imply any level of uptake, and prescribers should be aware of what medicines are available, but also what other options they may choose, and that might again be part and parcel of what other the principles of the NHS in Scotland. So again, some of the VPAS principles might work differently here as they compared to England, perhaps relating to your point about social prescribing and other issues.
Brian Biddle.
If I could take that topic a little bit further, interested to hear you, Matt, talk about pharmacy being perhaps a conduit into non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think you'd agree with me that the way the current system is set up, it's really set up for pharmaceutical interventions, and that connectivity between, a pharmaceutical intervention along with a social prescribing or some other sort of non-pharmaceutical intervention is not there. And to make that effective, the current system has to change, and that is going to take a serious intervention along development of technology and communication, probably. When we talk about technology, what we're actually talking about is the ability for healthcare professionals to communicate and understand. So if I say MSK with obesity is obviously there's a comparable increase in it's problematic if you have an MSK issue and you happen to be overweight. So as one reduces, as somebody's weight reduced, you would imagine that the medication required would reduce as well. But the system's not in place just now. So where are we in terms of getting to a position where a technology system enables that kind of intervention?
I think the answer to that, Mr. Whittle, is probably we're just at the start of the journey in that. I don't think we're anywhere near a place where those two are aligned, essentially, as you were kind of outlining. I think for me, again, pharmacy has a public health element to their contract. So we deal in smoking cessation, sexual health. There are other areas such as weight management that you touch on that we could build in, and I see social prescribing ultimately forming part of that. But you're right, the communication between not just healthcare professionals, but local organisations within communities, third sector organisations, social care just needs to be more joined up there to support that, so that myself as a frontline practitioner can recommend as part of a weight management consultation, for example, that there is that a patient should take a course of action that doesn't require maybe pharmacological, or, as you say, requires pharmacological intervention, because that decision may be made elsewhere in the patient's journey, but there may be a recommendation required that a non-pharmacological intervention might be required. And I think that really is probably the end point and the vision, I suppose, with regards to that joining social prescribing and traditional, if you like. And when we call it that, it illustrates your point perfectly that I'm saying that as a phrase, it's traditional medical interventions. But yeah, so it's a culture thing.
I would absolutely agree with your point about the system being skewed towards pharmaceutical interventions. And one's only got to look, I guess, certainly in days gone by, that the product or the evidence of a successful consultation with a GP was the production of a prescription. Fortunately, we are moving and have moved significantly from that. And I think social prescribing and all that implies is potentially very exciting in terms of looking at non-pharmaceutical interventions. The word of caution I would have there, though, is it really does then come back to this question about data and metrics. How do we know that what we're offering, what we're doing, is actually having the desired effect? And even with medicines, one of the points I made when I did my review was the data that was available to me, and in Scotland we have no shortage of data. what we lack is data that answers the questions we want to ask of it. The problem that the review had was there was very good managerial information about the number of medicines that were being prescribed, dispensed, perhaps even swallowed. What there wasn't was data about the impact they were having, the benefits that patients were accruing or not, or indeed when the medicines were stopping because of side effects and things like that. So we lack that total picture. And I think too, if we're going to head into social prescribing, as I think we should, we do need to have a bit of a pause to make sure that we have the right metrics and the right data to convince us that, what we're offering by way of that social prescribing is having the desired effect and is actually a worthwhile alternative.
Thank you very much. Alec Colhunt.
Good morning to the panel. Before I ask the question I intend to ask, I just wanted to say for the record, I think on Miles Briggs' point, ask a couple of questions about the PAX2 system and the changes that have come in since that was introduced. And Dr. Montgomery, you said that you hadn't sight of the data as to the efficacy of PAX2 in regard to its predecessor, which I believe was a patient access request. I think it's as I say, for the record, I think it's really vital for this committee that we get sight of any existing data to see, to compare those two systems, because we were given assurances when PAX2 came in, and it would be good to see how valid those assurances were. On to my question. Some submissions to the committee stated that the focus is usually on investing in new products, but disinvestment in certain products and activities does need to be more routinely discussed, and that seems quite an apposite suggestion given what we know about NHS inflation. Is there a role for any national body to decide what should no longer be used in terms of routine prescribing in pharmacy?
Lindsay McClure.
I think there isn't a specific national focus at the moment, but there are different national groups and kind of groups locally within health boards at regional level that will focus within their specialist clinical areas. Particularly health boards, area drug and therapeutics committees have got a really important role to maintain formularies and make sure that is indicating what are at any point in time, because the market is dynamic, to what is the most cost-effective product to be prescribed. And to make sure that there is support available within health boards to transfer patients from maybe a medicine that is less cost effective to one where the evidence says it's now more cost effective.
And does that, do they use that opportunity to disinvest or disindicate where appropriate?
Yeah, in terms of so biosimilars is a really good example where, yes, it's the same molecule, but there's still a lot of work involved in transferring from the established product to the new, more cost-effective biologic medicine. And again, although the focus might be local, there can be a lot of things done nationally as well, and are done to support boards.
Mark Barkley.
Yeah, I think Lindsay's explained well what happens, I suppose, at health boards with regards to formulary and choices for clinicians who are prescribing for patients. I think as well from that, I think part of the Achieving Excellence in Pharmaceutical Care strategy, alongside other policy documents such as Realistic Medicines, is, I suppose, having those conversations with patients about what they actually require and what is right for them. And certainly within our what was formerly known as the Chronic Medication Service, now Medicines Care and Review, we're starting to look at how can medication reviews become routine in community pharmacy and in other areas of the primary healthcare system, so that actually people are having these conversations with patients. And it might be that actually the patient themselves makes a decision after an informed discussion to not take a medicine for reasons of, possibly harm, side effects, or, it's just not been doing what the patient actually wanted it to do. So, I mean, that's on an individual patient, clinician to patient level.
Thank you very much. And I think we have both Brian Montgomery and Al MacDonald would like to contribute to that point.
I think under the horizon there's been an awful lot of what I would call casual or reactive disinvestment, but in many instances it's not been a planned strategic process, if you like. What I mean by that is that not just with regard to pharmaceuticals, but with other tests, treatments and interventions, there's been an approach to interventions that are thought to be of limited value, one thinks, for example, of tonsillectomy in children as the one that's always trotted out, but that is a good example whereby now it's very unusual for people to have their tonsils removed, whereas many years ago it was done in very high numbers of children. The problem is that while practice has changed, often driven by things like signed guidelines, what we've never done is said, okay, let's sit down and work out how much we're spending on that, then release that money and put it over there and spend it on that. Because of the kind of challenges and demands that we're all aware of, any money that is liberated very quickly gets absorbed someplace else to help manage either a development, an overspend, whatever it happens to be. So I think that the disinvestment and the reinvestment tends to be a very casual and reactive process rather than a planned exercise.
Alan MacDonald.
Just one or two brief points. Firstly, as Brian has said, just to emphasise the potential role that SIGN may have in responding to your question. Secondly, and in the point of competition, I guess where there is natural competition, as we've seen with hepatitis C medicines, then that is a mechanism whereby the most cost-effective drugs will get used and those that are not so cost-effective don't. On the bigger question of disinvestment of drugs, that gets quite complex, because if a medicine's been on the market for a few years and further data comes in to show that it is unacceptably toxic, then that's quite straightforward to say you can disinvest, or that perhaps the efficacy data hasn't been borne out in real life, so the license is withdrawn. That's relatively easy, but if you're looking at a medicine several years later and you find that it does work, but not as well as you thought it did, and perhaps it could still be used but not command the price, that's a potentially much bigger question to be dealing with. And that is a question that probably we will have to be addressing at some point as our interim acceptance option becomes more mature.
Convener. So I get from what Dr. MacDonald and Dr. Montgomery have just said that there is no sort of process of planned obsolescence in pharmaceutical or even any kind of therapy to that end. That it's a kind of incremental shift over, and often there's a legacy prescription of that old drug. So particularly in diseases or conditions where a wonder drug comes in, which is much better than any of its predecessors, there's no sort of process by which you can have a wholesale migration over to the wonder drug and then the obsolescence of its predecessor.
The wonder drug usually comes at quite a significant additional cost, and there is so it might be that the original drug still has a role because it is effective. And forgive me for going back to what I understand well in arthritis. If you look at methotrexate, which remains the biggest drug, it's been around for 60 years. Anti-TNF drugs as they came in 2002 and subsequently are better, but they're not 200 times better. So there is still sometimes a role for the existing drug. And I guess what we do at SMC is just say the wonder drug, and it's not a term I'm particularly fond of, because having said that our job is to say how much of a wonder drug is it, but it is to say this is this much better and it costs this much more. That can be acceptable. It can be acceptable in some but not all circumstances. I mean, I think your basic point is right, that sometimes the kind of obsolescence of drugs isn't completely planned, and some of this is ad hoc. So I do accept the point of your question, I think, is reasonable. But like I say, sometimes the introduction of a new medicine may not necessarily render the existing therapeutics as being obsolete.
Brian Montgomery.
Yeah, thank you. I have direct experience of a couple of what we would have called therapeutic substitutions, which is basically looking at a group of patients, the treatments that they're on, and looking at what the alternatives might be. And this was driven by cost effectiveness, so that we were able to look at statins in one of the health boards and see that the patients there, in the main, seem to be being prescribed a very expensive branded statin, and yet there was no demonstrable benefit compared with health boards that were using cheaper statins. We basically moved, with the patient's cooperation and permission, we moved them all from the expensive statin onto one that was available generically, releasing effectively somewhere significantly north of £1 million for reinvestment elsewhere within that health board's budgets. We did it to a lesser degree with a couple of other medicines, but I think these opportunities are rare and generally are about where you can use a substitution towards a generic. The issue that we run up against, which tends to cancel that out, is the one that Alan has highlighted, which is that often you get a new drug that comes along that infers benefits over and above existing treatments. And what you find is either it has to be used in addition to or instead of, but instead of at a greater price than its predecessor. So in terms of liberating funds, it's not often as fruitful as the statin example is.
Brian Whittle.
Okay,
very briefly.
Just going to labour a point, convener, if I may. To be effective, to have an effective disinvestment, sort of strategy, I would suggest would require the ability to gather and access appropriate data. And the thread that seems to have been running through all of this and many other investigations is the lack of the ability to gather and access appropriate data. I wonder if that is that a correct assumption around disinvestment?
Briefly, if you would, Lindsay.
I think definitely in terms of better outcomes data would help us once a product is in the market. We might have made that initial market access decision based on clinical trials. Patients in clinical trials are highly selective, so they might not be representative of the normal Scottish population. So having that real-world evidence over time could greatly help us in evaluating which is the most cost-effective once there's experience of use in the medicine. But to do that, we need much more efficient IT systems to be able to collect outcomes data. So I think we've already heard there are some great initiatives like the Cancer Medicines Optimisation Programme, but it's still early days. More work to be done.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the data is there to do the type of things that Brian was suggesting around generic substitution. That does happen in primary care with decisions being made at health board level where essentially you would move from a branded product or a certain generic product to another one. So that does happen, and that's communicated to community pharmacies so that we can adapt our our stock holding, etc. And we've got an awareness of that coming down the line. So that generally does happen in a relatively joined up way. There's probably just a small additional thing. We don't in pharmacy have the authority to generically substitute, but it is something that is probably it certainly sits in that as a reserved legislation, but it is something that I think as experts in medicines that pharmacists could possibly embrace, albeit it is, as Brian rightly pointed out, it's relatively rare to be happening nowadays. But that's something that we had in our submission that pharmacists could potentially do in the future.
Thank you very much. Another very brief supplementary from Alice Briggs.
Just the discussion we've had in looking, and just to throw this in at the end, I suppose, looking at the effectiveness and outcomes, where would you then look to benchmark the methadone programme we have in Scotland then, when you look at it through that lens?
I think I wasn't expecting that to come up today, I have to say, Mr. Briggs, but yeah. I think the programme itself is, I mean, again, I'll point to the fact that, we have a statutory obligation to supply the product. We interact with these patients on a daily basis. Quite often, these patients are actually the kind of Hep C patients as well that we're kind of talking about as well. So I think the whole economic argument around methadone its evidence base is well recognised at an international level. There's a whole socio-economic argument around, if patients who weren't on that particular therapy, the whole socio-economic cost, not to mention, the quality of life that these patients have. So I think it is a complex picture. We certainly are working within health boards and even to a degree nationally to see what additionality we can add to services to support patients in that area. So it's not just the supply itself, it's actually, certainly in my own practice, we've done things around patients' lifestyle, oral hygiene, just about needle exchange, all sorts of things to support patients in this area. So success is, I suppose, based on some of those factors, in my opinion.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be quick, and there is a wee issue about disincentivise, or I guess changing how we're going to invest with like warfarin, and because warfarin requires blood testing that's frequent, and then there's those additional associated costs, and then the new drugs are coming along where they might just replace warfarin. So tests of change are being done currently, so we'll be looking at how do we switch these patients off these meds, and then how does that benefit? So that's one issue. My other issue is probably a question directly for Matt about, you probably heard my last question about how paracetamol can be bought for 20 pence in the high street, but because of the way the Scottish Drugs Tariff is negotiated with community pharmacies, that prices vary, so the NHS will pay more for drugs like paracetamol to community pharmacies. So how do we reconcile that? How do we make changes to that?
Yeah, I'll take up the second point. Yeah, Ms Harper, no problem. It is around this whole drug tariff basket that we talk about. I think as a clinician, I suppose paracetamol has a really strong evidence base as well. It's for mild to moderate pain, so an analgesia. So to take that away from a clinician, and primarily paracetamol, and the cost of paracetamol is borne from patients who have chronic pain conditions. So if you were to take that away, there is, of course, the risk that you move up, I suppose, the World Health Organization pain ladder next to paracetamol and ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is an effective analgesia as well, has a different safety profile. But you move beyond that, you then go into, I suppose, low-dose opioids right up the chain. So I think I think primarily self-care is by the public. You see paracetamol, you see analgesia in every supermarket, you see it in every garage, petrol station. So I think largely, it probably is bought if I've got a cough or a cold, I'll buy it myself when I'm in, a supermarket. But for patients that actually need it for mild to moderate pain, even for significant acute conditions, and for those with chronic pain, I think looking at the individual cost of the medicine is it's probably more the value around the medicine that I would rather focus on. Although I do appreciate that actually it could look, the difference could be significant.
Brian Montgomery.
If I could pick up on the warfarin example. It's been suggested quite often that there is an opportunity here if we were able to take everyone that is currently on warfarin and put them onto one of the newer agents. Would that remove the requirement for blood tests and all that goes with that? The answer is possibly, but what would happen is that the only way to actually take resource out in terms of no longer doing blood tests would be if you are able, quite frankly, to lose some employees. So the people that do the blood tests were no longer required, or the laboratories that did the blood tests were no longer required. And neither of these scenarios is going to happen, because what you have is really the blood tests and indeed the testing forming a small part of the activity of whether that's a practice nurse or whether it's the local haematology laboratory. The currency we really need to use here is, were we to do that, we would release some capacity. We would create some capacity in terms of additional nurse appointments. We would create some capacity in terms of a bit more space in the lab to do either more tests or do the tests that they do in a different time scale. But I think if we are looking at some of this potential for reinvestment, disinvestment, we have to be bit more sophisticated than just basically saying we're no longer doing that, therefore we'll save that amount of money, that's money that can come out of the system. I think increasingly the currency is going to be around capacity and how we then use that. And let's face it, capacity is what we need to help us address some of our challenges like waiting times.
Thank you very much. David Torrance.
Dr MacDonald, some of our written submissions raise questions about how well the appraisal process of SMC are currently working, and if they're in a position to deal with advancements in medicines. Can you go into more detail about what you are doing to prepare for a new generation of medicines?
I'm sorry, could you maybe just briefly repeat I didn't catch the whole question.
Some of our written submissions says that some of the processes were not up to scratch, basically, for the new medicines coming in. Can you go into more detail about what you're doing to cope with the advancement in medicines?
Obviously, as per my previous answer, I would like to take the opportunity of rejecting any suggestion that the process overall is any less robust. Our process, in many ways, remains the process that we have implemented since 2002, but through the 2013 and 2016 changes, that has changed. It has changed to allow greater access to medicines, cancer medicines and rare condition medicines, and that was a specific policy intent. And as I mentioned, the first point of Dr. Montgomery's review was that we had done that. We have introduced a lot of additional processes to help us get to that point. A lot of them have included patient and public involvement. Now, exactly the extent to which they have contributed to a higher acceptance rate is difficult to say, but I think they have been positive in themselves in bringing the patient and the public voice closer to the process. So I think we would like to think that the processes since 2013 and the processes that Brian outlined since 2016 are actually enhancing the process. If there are particular areas that have been highlighted from the submissions that have been suggested as being weaknesses, I'm obviously happy to address them either directly or later on. But we would feel that the changes we introduced since 2013 not only have met the policy intent, but actually have enhanced the process. And we feel that the changes that we are introducing likewise will continue to help us evolve in a positive way. But as I say, I'm more than happy to pick up on any specific point where perhaps respondents to this committee have felt that there's been a weakening. I'm happy to pick up on that.
Will Scotland also be required to appraise every new medicine as a result of a voluntary price regulation scheme? And if not, will that status be the nice status of appraisals in Scotland? What will that be?
In fact, with the VPAS arrangements, what in fact that has done has brought NICE processes closer to SMC processes. It has been and it remains our process to look at all new branded medicines, with one or two exceptions, which I don't think we need to go into. That has been our process, it remains our process, and we have no intention of changing that process, although it might be for certain types of medicines we produce different types of advice, different products, to try and make sure we are responding to the needs of the health service. Having said that, with VPAS, NICE processes at the moment are more closely aligned with what we've been doing. Of course, with changes here, with changes with NICE, processes sometimes align, sometimes they unalign. And I think it's important that we keep a clear focus on making sure that our processes are meeting the best needs of the NHS in Scotland.
Thank you very much. David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Earlier, Dr. Montgomery talked about data in Scotland. If I understand it right, he was saying there's enough data out there, has to be just a bit more appropriate. But my question's around prescribing data in hospital. How important is it to get that right? And I would certainly welcome any feedback anyone has about the HEPMAL project, the Hospital Electronic Prescribing and Medicines Administration. Perhaps someone can think of a slightly trendier title, but nevertheless, I'm interested in some information around prescribing data in hospitals.
Lindsay McClure or Brian Montgomery?
I have nothing to offer on this, I'm afraid.
Any volunteers in this one?
Otherwise, I have to ask about Brexit again, and you won't want that.
You've had your warning.
Just to respond to Mr. Whittle's comment that in all cases, more data is helpful and more robust data is more helpful, and that is true just about every bit of this system we're looking at, but that to some extent is a statement
I would
of the...
agree with that. And again, for the safe transfer of information between secondary care and primary care and community pharmacy, data is really important for things like medicines reconciliation and things like that. So the HEPMA programme, getting that right in secondary care is probably crucial to improving that safety element in primary care as well.
Very much. Brian Montgomery.
Yes, my only encouragement would be that given the potential opportunity that HEPMA is about to give us, that we don't fall into the trap of seeing it just as a system for administering medicines. It has to be something about capturing clinical outcome data so that we know what benefits we're getting from those medicines.
Makes sense. Okay.
But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, George Adam.
Good afternoon. I was going to say good morning, but we've kind of moved by that. One of the things I'm going to ask about pricing models and the costs of drugs in general, but basically you'll guess where I'm coming from because I'm talking about multiple sclerosis in particular, but also the fact that you've got branded and generic drugs. Obviously, I've spoken earlier on about the neurological consultant who actually has done this presentation where he effectively said these generic drugs are used in Scandinavia. Why can't we use them here? They do a similar thing to some of the branded product we are paying for here, and they cost a lot less. Now, on that, are we open to that when we're looking at pricing or value for the NHS and as time goes forward? Because logic dictates that if you can deal with something a lot less expense, then you'll be able to help out more people in general. So is there not a way that we could be looking at that? And also, you guys have flung in biosimilars into this as well to kind of add to my reading material for further reading. But that looks like an interesting side of this argument as well.
Lindsay McClure.
I think when decisions are made about a medicine, they won't be considering is it a brand versus a generic. It'll be considering the price of the medicine, the clinical effectiveness of the medicine, and making a kind of decision in the round. I think the issue that you might be referring to is there are a handful of cases where you might have a licensed medicine on the UK market, and there is another medicine and there is evidence that it has comparable effectiveness, but it is not licensed for use in that indication. So I'm aware there is one example in multiple sclerosis. Probably the most high-profile example at the moment is in macular degeneration, where there are two in-patent medicines on the market, Eylea and Lucentis, and there is another medicine, Avastin, which is a cancer medicine, but not licensed for macular degeneration, where the evidence suggests there's comparable clinical effectiveness. In that particular case, there was a movement in the northeast of England to prescribe Avastin, even though that it wasn't licensed for that particular indication. There was a subsequent legal challenge, and that is currently going through the courts. So I think everybody is watching that case very carefully, which could be a game changer in that particular scenario.
Brian Montgomery.
Just to amplify that slightly, there is also the issue that, as a doctor, I am required by the GMC to prescribe the licensed product and not the unlicensed product. So even though I know or think it's basically the same medicine in a different coloured box that has the same effect, I cannot prescribe it if it doesn't have the licence. And there is a licensed alternative available.
Yep.
Can I possibly add, just when we're talking about drugs in general with the SMC, how they go through the process. Obviously, I'm the convener of the cross-party group in MS, surprisingly. My wife just doesn't like me away from these things. But one of the drugs that promised a lot but has failed SMC on a number of occasions is Vampira, which claimed that basically when I said earlier on if my wife could just walk down that corridor as a benefit, it claimed it could do that. But when you look at this, is back to what Dr. MacDonald was saying, when you have that, the debate with me as a husband of someone that has MS would be, I want to see her do that, I want that to happen, but me, the politician, is sitting here looking at your submission and I'm actually seeing that it didn't actually do what it promised and set out. And the debate in the media tends to be, why are these people not getting this drug? And that's what puts you in an unfortunate position, but it makes it quite difficult when you're trying to have this debate. And I'm just using that as one example, because you could no doubt tell me numerous others.
Alan MacDonald.
So this partly was around my previous comment about our job is to look at a medicine and say objectively how much better is this. I think a comment was made earlier about the quality of evidence from European Medicines Agency, and it's true that some drugs come to us with less evidence than before. But if a medicine comes to us and it's licensed by the EMA, we have to assume that it has been shown that the benefits outweigh the risks. Our job is different, is to say, do the benefits justify the costs? So any drug that we look at, we have to accept it does some good, but in some circumstances, the benefits may be modest compared to what's there, and it's our job to say that. And it's the bit that often gets missing from the public discourse, is about the saying, this is a wonder drug, again, not our language, but this is a real advance, and this is a modest advance. And a modest advance still might get acceptance if the pricing reflects that. So a drug that we say, well, actually, we're not sure the benefits are great, but there may be some, they may be useful. If the pricing, or the reimbursement, I should say, reflects that, we can still approve that. You're correct in the context of MS, just to go on to that. We've looked at a number of drugs for relapsing and remitting MS, where it's been possible to say yes. In the context of progressive MS, which arguably is a greater unmet need, that space medicines have been perhaps less positive. But as I say, if we have a medicine that seems to offer even a modest benefit, if the costs reflect that, we can still approve. Yeah.
And just for the record, when you're looking at the costs, what do you take into account? How does that go? And is that part of it, the research cost that's maybe getting bumped on by the pharmaceutical company, or what?
We look at the list price with any patient access scheme that is offered. So that's the cost of the medicine that we consider. We do consider the overall costs of the new medicine against what's there before. So, there are costs of what we do at the moment and there are costs of the new medicine. And taking the warfarin example, we would bring in some of the service costs of INR monitoring with warfarin. So in our economic analysis, the cost of the medicine is the list price minus any patient access scheme. And of course, one of the best ways of reducing uncertainties is for companies to give her a bigger patient access scheme. So we look at specific costs, but we do look at overall service costs as well, and we compare that to the costs of what is currently in place in NHS Scotland.
Thank you very much, and can I thank the witnesses? I know we'll be returning to issues of interest to community pharmacy as well as others later in the inquiry, but that's once again been a very helpful session. Thank you very much. And if, as I said to the previous panels, if there's anything in addition you feel we should, you would like to draw to our attention after we leave this here today, then please simply let us know that. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we are scheduled to move into private session for a further discussion. We'll give it just a moment, but my proposal will be